Welcome everyone to the first of two classes that we teach on disaster mental health. This one today is focusing on stress first aid and self-care. There will be a later class, either in November or December, on the full model of psychological first aid. That takes longer to teach. And trying to do both the stress first aid and self-care portion and the psychological first aid portion in the same class tends to take a day, like set aside 6 to 8 hours. So we're not going to do that. We're splitting it up. I want to note here that this course, the notes that you all received and what goes on these slides, was put together with the assistance of mental health professionals like counselors, therapists, psychologists, etc. And was just yesterday reviewed by a therapist who volunteers for Sanctum of the Craft to make sure that it was up to date and accurate. I am not a licensed therapist. My degree is not in that. I am, however, a clergy counselor and chaplain. If that distinction matters to you, now you know. But again, this was constructed with the help of people who are mental health professionals that volunteer for us. Okay, moving right along. Who are we? We are Sanctum of the Craft. We are an anarcho-socialist witchcraft collective, seminary, and church, which is how I'm clergy. We do not require that anyone belong to our seminary or our church or our religion in order to make use of any of our content. You don't have to be a witch to attend our classes. We don't care what you believe as long as you respect the belief of everyone else present. I am a street medic in addition to everything else that I am, and this class is geared for any first responders in addition to anyone who might weather a disaster. Now, you don't know whether you'll go through a disaster in your lifetime. Could happen to you, could not, but this is part of our ongoing class on street medicine, and so some of this is geared towards being a responder who goes out and assists people in a disaster. Everyone clear? Okay, moving right along. Natural and man-made disasters are increasingly common. I feel like you can just look at the news on any given day and probably notice that they're happening more often and that they are, in fact, more severe than they used to be. Natural disasters are catastrophic events caused by natural phenomena. This includes fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, mudslides, and earthquakes. Man-made disasters are catastrophic events caused by human activities or by negligence. These include industrial accidents, oil spills, building collapses, and acts of terrorism. Acts of terrorism include mass shootings, bombings, chemical weapons attacks, and attacks such as what occurred on 9/11. There is an argument to be made that even climate-related disasters are man-made, in that long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns are primarily caused by human activities. Climate disasters are becoming more common, specifically due to human action and inaction. Some natural disasters may actually be prevented if we address the root causes of climate change, but they have occurred throughout human history, so they will never be fully eradicated. Even if we all did what we should do and banded together and addressed climate change and did what we could to reverse the course of global warming, it's not going to change the fact that natural disasters happened before we started actively warming our atmosphere. Does that make sense? Cool. Moving on. Both natural and man-made disasters lead to loss of life, property damage, social disruption, and mental health crises. Let's talk a little bit about the mounting scale of this. An earthquake in China in 1976 resulted in at least 255,000 deaths and as many as 655,000 deaths. Approximately 230,000 people died in the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. The terrorist attack on 9/11 killed 2,976 people and injured thousands more, and first responders are still suffering from ill health effects. And that does not get into the cost of the ridiculous war that we got into afterwards and all the many, many people we killed who were not involved at all. According to the Institute, Hurricane Katrina was directly responsible for 1,392 deaths, plus all of the displacement and property destruction. According to the Institute for Economics and Peace's Global Terrorism Index, which relies on data from Terrorism Tracker, 8,352 people died due to terrorist attacks in 2023 worldwide. Now, that's what gets actually labeled a terrorist attack rather than what I would necessarily consider a terrorist attack, because, of course, the actions of our military are never considered terrorist attacks. The Gun Violence Archive recorded that in 2023, 722 people died in mass shootings in the United States. And of course, it isn't only deaths that should be considered. There are also the injured, the people who become disabled for life, the loss of homes and personal property, the devastation to medical and social infrastructure. Wildfires, floods, hurricanes, and other disasters wipe entire communities away, leaving people without housing, clean water, etc. And rebuilding is difficult. Rebuilding alone is a traumatic process, let alone adapting to the loss of a loved one, the loss of a pet, the loss of your belongings. Just rebuilding can be traumatic. Worldwide, people of lower socioeconomic means are more likely to become disaster victims because their homes are more often built in high-risk areas and are also more likely to suffer from a lack of support during the recovery and rebuilding phases. Let's talk about resiliency. I want to note here that this is not a full community resiliency training, okay? We do talk about community resiliency in other trainings that we have in our crisis preparedness course. You can also get free community resiliency training. There's one coming up in Orange County in Chapel Hill, like this week, another one coming up next month. I highly recommend that if you intend to operate as a street medic, you get community resiliency training. Management of acute stress reactions following a natural or man-made disaster need to aim for fostering resilience. Resilience is the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties and or the ability and elasticity to metamorphically spring back into shape. Metaphorically. In disaster mental health, it refers to the ability of a person, a group of people, and or a community to adapt and even to improve and to grow from enduring adversity, stress, and trauma. It involves a set of skills and behaviors, maintaining a sense of purpose, managing emotions, as well as strong social connections. Resilience is not the absence of adversity. It is the ability to move through it to the other side and then be better prepared for the next time that it occurs. All right, now I get into controversy. This is not the only controversy we're going to talk about in this class, but it is the first chunk of it. This is me clarifying what we're not teaching and why. If you want to argue with me about it, please save the argument until after class. Okay? I'm happy to have it with you. I'd like to see your sources. I'm happy to show you mine. But this is going to be controversial amongst many people who work in mutual aid, but it needs to be said. This guide is not based in CISD, which is Critical Incident Stress Debriefing. There has been extensive research performed related to the effectiveness of CISD in mitigating long-term negative outcomes following traumatic incidents. There are multiple studies showing that individuals who go through CISD feel as though it helped them. They think that it did. If you ask them 5 years later, do you think it was helpful? They will probably tell you yes. There are multiple studies showing that individuals who go through CISD were not helped. They just think they were. There is no evidence that CISD prevents long-term negative outcomes after a traumatic incident or amongst first responders to multiple traumatic incidences. Furthermore, it may actually increase the risk for developing post-traumatic stress disorder. This has been thoroughly examined and agreed upon by mental health professionals and verified in many clinical studies. This has been verified for decades now. Proponents of CISD claim that it was improperly implemented in all of these studies and maintain that when properly implemented, it can have long-term positive effects on mental health outcomes. However, it is the position of Sanctum of the Craft that if the system cannot be properly implemented based on publicly available guidance in order to replicate these positive effects, then any attempts to utilize the system based on said publicly available guidance in the field is ineffective. If the scientists who are trying to study it can't duplicate the methodology in a way that works, then neither can the average group of street medics. CISD is part of Critical Incident Stress Management, a system for support for individuals and groups who have been exposed to trauma that includes pre-incident preparedness and then acute crisis management through the crisis, followed by a post-crisis follow-up. It is ultimately based on a cornerstone of CISD. We have not based it on that system. And there's parts of CISM that I don't disagree with, but CISD is not part of this training. Instead, this guide and the one to follow are based on flexible multimodal approach that incorporates stress first aid, psychological first aid, community resiliency, and personal resiliency. We want to note here that it is Sanctum of the Craft's official position that people in communities are capable of adaptation, that throughout human history, resiliency is the default response to disaster, not the abnormal response to disaster. However, everything occurs in context. It is extremely variable how individuals and communities respond to trauma. Some are protective and resilient, while others are more vulnerable to collapse. If we can identify which factors increase vulnerability, we can potentially address those factors and help create more resilient communities and help create more resilient individuals. Let's talk about systems of response. The systems of response include both pre-established organized systems of response and spontaneous systems of response. Somebody, what do you think street medics are?
Depends on the street medic.
Excellent answer, Ian. You only cheated a little bit by having been trained with us for decades now. Both. What group of street medics are you talking about? How were they trained? Are you talking about an organized, prepared collective that has been, doing pre-action planning and practicing their SOPs and they roll out? Or are you talking about a single street medic who's like, yeah, I'll go help? Okay, it's both. Organized systems include government response, the United Nations Children's Fund, FEMA, police, EMS, and firefighters. Formalized disaster-specific organization, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent, the World Health Organization, and various other non-governmental organizations, including major aid nonprofits. Spontaneous response involves a community coming together to assist each other in the wake of a disaster in the form of collective and mutual aid, including self-deployed first responders, such as street medics, who just decide to go help. After any disaster, response systems converge. The first population to respond in a disaster is almost always the directly affected population, which responds in an informal way to assist each other. How that system of response operates is extremely variable based on the enormous variability of those who respond, as their response is based on their own background, their own training, the availability of their resources, etc. Spontaneous response is often untrained and consists of just those who want to help each other. Some long-term preparedness and recovery organizations have been created out of groups that formed for spontaneous response. Like a group got together and was like, we're going to go help. And then they were like, hey, that wasn't so hard. We were able to help a lot of people. Let's keep doing that. That's how a lot of street medic collectives got started. Government response often occurs directly after spontaneous response with emergency medical services and the police. The response after that is generally from a combination of governmental and non-governmental organizations working in and around each other. These complex systems all have different responsibilities and levels of accountability, as well as different motivations. They tend to cooperate in complex and overlapping ways. 5 stages of disaster. There are 5 stages of disaster, all of which can impact the mental health of both the people directly affected by the crisis and the responders who come to assist them differently. These are the warning or threat phase, the rescue phase, also called the life or death phase or the heroic phase, the honeymoon phase, the disillusionment phase, and the recovery and reconstruction phase. The warning or threat phase. Depending on the type of disaster, this varies a lot. Sometimes there is enough warning that people can evacuate an area, and other times the disaster strikes suddenly with very little warning. When there is a lot of warning, people may find that the looming disaster affects their mental health, causing anxiety. If they have previously experienced a disaster that affected their mental health, they may be either more affected due to previous trauma or better prepared with personal resiliency mechanisms already in place. In this scenario, people who do not heed the advance warning may be negatively impacted later by that choice when it comes to mental health, taking on additional guilt and self-blame. So imagine for a moment that you are the deciding person in a family and you say, no, we don't need to leave. We don't need to leave. We've had plenty of storms before. They're never that bad. We can stay. And then your house is destroyed and you lose the family pet. Maybe, God forbid, you also lose your child or your spouse. Then you have that self-blame and that recrimination. I should have done. I could have done. Why didn't I? So you're going to have a different impact from somebody who left, right? When there is no warning or very little warning, people are more likely to feel as though they had no control over the crisis, which can impact mental health later. It can also make people feel more fear and less hope for the future, as sudden crisis could, theoretically, come with no warning again. So if it just suddenly struck and now the house is gone, that's going to have a different effect than if someone had plenty of warning. Rescue, life or death, heroic phase. This phase follows immediately after the disaster hits. Many of the people who are active and responding during this time period are the impacted community members, rather than the systems of response that come in later, along with trained first responders, EMS, firefighters, police, street medics, CERT, which is community emergency response teams. They're trained by FEMA, but they are just members of the community. The rescue phase can vary a lot depending on the type of crisis. Slow building threats, slowly encroaching wildfires, slowly climbing floodwaters, have a different impact than fast moving threats. Rapidly approaching wildfires, sudden rising water, mudslides, earthquakes, bombings, mass shootings, tornadoes, things that sweep through an area with very little warning. Just like how disasters with a lot of warning impact people differently than disasters that have none, the speed and scope of the destruction can impact mental health as well. The greater the speed and or scope of the disaster, the greater the psychological effects will be. The responses of survivors and responders during this time will vary. Some are going to be really shocked, some will be in panic, some will be confused, and some will be aggressive. But the majority will likely react with strength, compassion, and cooperation. That is the default. People shine during disaster. I'm aware that that's not generally what the news focuses on. I'm aware that that's not what disaster movies like to show us because that's not dramatic. But in actuality, the vast majority of people during a disaster want to help each other and they try to help each other. And it's when they feel that they have failed to do so that we start seeing some really bad, traumatic outcomes for them. They place themselves at risk to protect others. Often during this phase, trauma from separation or bereavement first appears. This is when people start going, where's my mom? Where's my dad? Where's my kid? Where's grandma? Where's grandpa? Where's my pet? And going, where are they? Where are they? I don't know where they are. And either they don't find them, or in some cases they do and they have gone on. Honeymoon phase. This phase is when the rest of the systems of response actually arrive at the disaster. The community may be flooded with disaster response personnel, all focused on meeting the needs of those affected. During this period, governmental, public, and private assistance is often readily available. There is an outpouring of support and goodwill. A lot of promises are made during this time period. A lot of promises are made. Not all of those promises will be kept. This is often the period where the first mental health responders begin interacting with the affected. At this point, many survivors will be focused on their basic needs: food, water, shelter, and clothing, and the safety of their friends and family. They may still be trying to find their family members at shelters. Some survivors will be experiencing relief at having survived, joy at finding missing loved ones, and hope for the future because of the outpouring of support. Others may be dealing with the loss of their homes, bereavement from loved ones who didn't survive, guilt, self-blame, etc., and at this point can act and feel resentful, angry, withdrawn, or hopeless. Survivors often begin to comprehend the magnitude of what has happened during this phase. They may feel overwhelmed, shocked, horrified, hopeless. They may also be in denial of the impact of their mental health. Some survivors will shut down and ignore their basic needs, while others will begin to involve themselves more deeply in disaster relief process in order to distract themselves and focus their energy on helping others because they feel like they can't help themselves. Then we enter the disillusionment phase. The period after the honeymoon phase is when the worst of the impact on mental health often becomes apparent. As the impact of the losses become apparent, aid evaporates, and any incomplete response from the government is identified. During this phase, depending on how it is handled, the community may begin to recover or they may tip over into a new disaster. Sometimes the community skips directly into disillusionment without any time in the honeymoon phase. Why might that happen? Why might a community skip over the honeymoon phase and right into disillusionment? Well said. The government doesn't show up. The government does not come and help. The community response is lacking. There isn't an outpouring of aid, which a lot of the time has to do with the press. If the press show up and they make a big deal, there tends to be an outpouring of aid. If the press does not show up and does not make a big deal, then there tends to be a lackluster response from the community, and there isn't a lot of aid to be found. And survivors are often left going like, hey, Why does no one care when it happens in our neighborhood? Why do they only care when it happens in that neighborhood full of like white, privileged, affluent people? Why does it only matter when it's them? Okay. Depending on how this is handled, the community can begin to recover. They might be able to get over the fact that they never had their honeymoon phase, but in communities that have already been affected by other disasters, very low income communities that may already have felt failed by the system, or in communities where the systems of response move very slowly or didn't provide anywhere near enough aid, you're going to see some mental health effects from that. Sometimes the disillusionment phase takes a few days to set in, starting after the honeymoon phase as responders begin to tire, the scope of the disaster becomes better understood, and the victims struggle with their new reality. Sometimes it takes a few weeks and begins as relief agencies and volunteer groups pull out, leaving the survivors feeling abandoned. At some point, the media leaves, the outside world has no knowledge of what's going on anymore, and people stop trying to help. Physical health among survivors often worsens during this period. There is sometimes a lack of clean water, good food, restful or safe places to sleep. Good hygiene may be difficult to maintain. Disasters often have their own specific physical health effects, such as inhalation damage from smoke and ash from wildfires, or mold inhalation from floodwaters. These physical health effects also impact mental health. It is always interconnected. I'm going to stress that now. I'm going to continue stressing it. Mental, emotional, and physical health are not separate things. They are always interconnected. Families, friends, and community members often start to have strife and conflict with each other at this period, with feelings of resentment and jealousy being really common. As members of the community who weren't directly affected or weren't affected as significantly return to their normal lives, the members who are not able to do so can feel very hostile towards them. Like, why do you get to move on and I don't? Reconstruction and recovery phase. This is when the community begins to rebuild. It may start within days and take anywhere from weeks to years, depending on the scale of the disaster. People have to make major adjustments, especially in cases where they're experienced extremely difficult, life-changing losses, such as the loss of their homes or loved ones. Support from the community, from friends, and even from family can deteriorate as people who are less affected just move on. They move back to their normal lives. Some people will find that they have more support than they imagined as a resilient community comes together to heal. Some people may also find that they are more personally resilient than they thought that they were, able to recover themselves and then turn around and help other people. A small subset of those affected will struggle during this period with significant mental health difficulties, syndromes, and disorders. They may require professional intervention from mental health providers. The degree to which response systems address mental health during disasters is also extremely variable. Systems of response for mental health. The World Health Organization has a template for mental health during emergencies, the WHO AIMS E. The World Health Organization Assessment Instrument for Mental Health Systems, WHO AIMS, is a WHO tool that collects essential information on the mental health system of a country or region. The E signifies emergency. It emphasizes needing a preparation plan for readiness and a response plan that is geared to respond to specific kinds of incidences. The WHO has found that how other systems respond to the disaster in general has a major impact on how the trauma impacts later mental health. Better systems of response create better mental health outcomes in communities, even when those systems of response are not specifically addressing mental health in traumatized individuals. However, a system that does take into account the mental health of those affected is likely to have even better outcomes. I'm going to clarify and simplify what I just said. Just having the systems of response do a good job, show up, actually help people, actually help a community recover, improves mental health outcomes. Okay, so we know that we're going to see, as these systems of response are gutted financially, a decline in mental health services. Now, additionally, if those those systems of response also address mental health, we tend to see an even bigger improvement in mental health outcomes after disaster. But even just showing up and doing their job helps. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, has developed and provided mental health all hazards disaster planning guidelines for state and local planners. It also stresses preparation and planning beforehand, then goes into detail on what mobilization for different kinds of disasters should look like. However, it does not emphasize early intervention or education as early intervention response systems. Government and non-governmental organizations have begun to implement mental health support as part of their system of response, include the United Nations, UNICEF, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, FEMA, and the U.S. Department of Defense, firefighters, and emergency medical services. No, I'm not going to call it the U.S. Department of War. Specialized mental health groups working on disaster mental health responses in the United States include the American Psychiatric Association Disaster Response Committee, the Disaster Response Network of the American Psychological Association, the All Hazards Disaster Planning Group of the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, and the National Association of Social Workers. It is vital that mental health be a consideration in system response, not only to address those traumatized by being the victim of a disaster, but also to maintain the mental health of responders so that the systems do not lose responding members to direct and vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. We're going to get into those in a little bit. Disaster response systems need to have effective mental health strategies as part of their response process for both the people they are serving and the people who work in their system. This is true for any system affected by disaster, whether that be government, hospitals, schools, etc. Schools are often important centers for early intervention programs for children after traumatic events. Healthcare systems are vital centers for mental health services during and after a disaster, but also need to provide mental health support for their healthcare workers. Now, I want you to think for a minute about disaster response systems being gutted, school systems being gutted of funding, and hospitals being gutted of funding. And think about what that's going to do to mental health after disasters. We are going to have to start seeing more collective aid dedicated to mental health support. We're going to. That either we're going to step up and do something, or we're going to see the effects when we don't. Okay. Ways systems can support good mental health. Systems of response can support good mental health in their responders to a disaster and in the communities they serve via compassionate leadership, planning and preparation for emergencies, practice with the disaster scenarios and standard operating procedures, engagement of leadership with the members of the response teams, flexible interaction with other systems of response, clear communication and information sharing with other systems of response, quality, readily available mental health care for everyone involved, from responders to leadership, providing members with resiliency training, ongoing education for members, systems to acknowledge achievement, and building a culture that encourages learning and improvement. Ways that systems can damage mental health. Systems of response can damage the mental health of their responders, and that damage can spread to the communities they serve if those systems lack compassionate leadership, fail to hold people responsible and accountable, lack communication between responders and leadership, lack leadership consulting and listening to their responders, fail to prepare for emergencies, fail to practice the plans that are prepared, favor negative leadership styles, protect negative members of the systems, bullies, harassers, people who sexually assault people, promote a culture of toxic masculinity, promote a pull yourself up by your bootstraps culture, fail to educate their members, fail to support their members' mental health, fail to acknowledge and reward achievement, ignore advances in the scientific knowledge of how to best respond, refuse to adapt and change to emerging knowledge and needs, foster a culture of ignorance, foster a blame culture, fail to be flexible in times of high stress, and refuse to provide mental health services, and fail to value their members. When systems of response fail to build a supportive system for their members, that often affects the community that they operate in. Responders who are additionally stressed from system dysfunction or failure, feel abandoned or betrayed by the system they work for, or take on self-blame may inadvertently pass that trauma on to the community that they are serving. They will likely also burn out faster, thus making it harder for them to continue the work and do the work well. Question for you all. If street medic collectives are a system of response, does this ways you can do it right and ways you can do it wrong apply to street medic collectives? Excellent, you got that right. I've had that argument before. I think I won. Okay. Trauma. It's time and location delayed. The impacts of trauma may appear over a prolonged period, delayed significantly from the events that caused that trauma. The impact may also appear far from the site of the disaster. The impact may also spread from the primary and even secondary victims in what's called a contagion effect, often extending through complex systems of families, friend groups, and communities. Vicarious trauma may also occur amongst individuals who witness or experience the disaster secondhand. So let me walk you through this. The person who lost their house is the primary victim, right? But then the person that they tell all about the horror of what they've been through, or they pick fights with, or they start to traumatize because they're traumatized, now they're passing it on, that's a secondary victim. So is the responder who comes in and sees the bodies crushed in the wreckage, right? That's a secondary victim. It didn't directly affect them, but now they have that trauma. If instead a responder didn't see the body crushed in the wreckage, but they did go to a CISD debriefing and have that body graphically described to them by another responder, that can give them vicarious trauma. Does that help you understand those three terms? Excellent. Early intervention. Early intervention is often claimed to be extremely important for preventing severe mental health crises in response to traumatic events, but what exactly does it mean? The term is used to describe support for the development of good mental health early in people's lives, from birth through their teenage years. Intervention early in the stages of a mental health problem developing, whenever that may be in a person's lifespan, and for intervention early after a traumatic event. The truth is, all of these are early interventions. There isn't a like, oh, one of them is an early intervention, the other should be called something else. Those are all considered a form of early intervention, and all of them are important for preventing traumatic events from causing or worsening mental health crises. Early intervention in childhood includes addressing environmental factors, pollution, lead exposure, nutritional factors, socioeconomic factors, school inequality, access to early mental health education and screening, inability to access mental health support, family interventions, and providing children with safe communities in which to grow up. It also includes learning resilience and self-regulation skills beginning in early childhood. In terms of disasters, early intervention is often focused on the prevention of the development of PTSD, the prevention of trauma from causing or worsening other mental health problems, syndromes, and disorders, depression, anxiety, non-suicidal self-harm, suicide, post-traumatic psychosis, etc. So far, the most effective early intervention in disasters have been found to be a combination of stress first aid, psychological first aid, and mental health first aid. You really need all of those working in combination. Okay, that's what has actually been found to be pretty damn effective. Okay, stress first aid, it was developed by the military. It is part of military resiliency programs. It focuses on general stress reactions that can be used to identify and address early signs of a person's stress responses in whatever environment. The goal is to identify stress reactions on a continuum, on a spectrum, so that intervention can happen before it develops into a severe stress response. It can be self-applied or applied to others. It is in common use amongst high-risk responders, including law enforcement, military, emergency medical services, etc. Stress first aid steps include check, coordinate, cover, calm, connect, competence, and confidence. It's all C's. Psychological first aid is used as part of disaster response and is designed to help people traumatically affected by a disaster to be more stable and access resources so that they can recover. It was originally designed only for those with mental health backgrounds, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. But it has now been structured so that it can be offered by other responders, including self-deployed responders such as street medics. It's now designed so that it can be done peer-to-peer. When we teach it, we will be teaching it as a peer-to-peer interaction where you are not above someone or being like a psychological provider, like a mental health professional for them, but you are doing it to assist your communities. Does that make sense? Okay. Contrary to some opinions, it isn't actually designed to offer therapy, which is intended to treat a mental health condition, but instead to reduce initial stress and encourage adaptation and resiliency. It doesn't assume that people have or will develop a mental health problem or disorder or address or focus on mental illness. It can be used in the field during disasters, but also later at temporary shelters and hospitals where people are treated for their injuries, etc. The core actions of psychological first aid include engagement, safety, stabilization as needed, gathering information, providing practical assistance, connection, psychoeducation on healthy coping tactics, and linkage with services as needed. It is complicated. The shortest I've ever been able to train someone in that is 5 hours, and I'm really trying to get it down to 3. I'm working on it. Okay. Mental health first aid is a program that teaches people to recognize and address mental health problems, syndromes, and disorders, and substance use disorders so that they can intervene until professional help can step in. It is used to recognize the problem, provide the person suffering with a peer who cares, and then connect them directly with professional assistance. It teaches people to identify risk factors, signs and symptoms in members of their family, friends, community, work colleagues, etc. The core steps include assessing, listening non-judgmentally, giving reassurance and information, encouraging someone to get professional help, and encouraging someone to self-help. I cannot teach you mental health first aid. It is actually a program that you have to go through specific people to get trained in. They have to actually have like the certification as an instructor for it, which I do not have. I have my certificate that I passed mental health first aid myself, but I don't have the instructor certificate. I think street medics should get it, but you need to be aware it's slightly ableist. Yes. So sometimes works offer it, like Ian's work offered it, and he took it through them. They actually wanted as many people in the job to do it. You can also find it sometimes being offered by local programs, like going all this year and then starting again next year. There's a group in Orange County that's doing it, and theirs is under $30, which it can be more than that. So that's a very reasonable price for it. How much they're supposed to charge, I don't know. But I have seen it being offered for like $175 a person. I've seen it offered for as low as $30 a person. I think that people should take it. I just think that depending on who's teaching it, it may or may not come across as quite ableist. I happen to have one really good instructor when I took it and one not so good instructor who had never actually heard of the term ableism before. So, fun. Anyway, an integrated approach that combines all three with other emergency response systems, focusing on providing for basic survival needs, may be the most effective at managing mental health for both those directly affected by a disaster and for responders who are exposed to both primary and secondary trauma, and of course, vicarious trauma. I should have said all three, while assisting. Unfortunately, all three models really focus on preventing and or managing acute stress symptoms, mental health issues, mental health crises, and acute stress disorder. They do not include some aspects of early intervention like building community resiliency. They need to be used in combination with other early intervention methods, but guidelines for doing so are currently quite lacking. Additionally, most of the current models stop after a person is referred out to existing mental health services. There isn't a focus on recovery and rehabilitation in a community other than referral to therapy and other mental health services. A more robust model might also include means to provide ongoing support to loved ones or members of one's community while they are engaged in formal treatment or if formal treatment is inaccessible to them. Community resiliency. So, what's a community? Depending on the context, a community can be people who live in close proximity geographically within physical boundaries and borders. It can be people who share history, culture, language, interests, values, and or laws. It can be people who share a race or ethnicity. It can be people of the same socioeconomic status. It can be people who have a sense of belonging when with each other. Communities are interrelated with relationships and interactions among individuals and groups. Communities also contain some type of social system that addresses problems. Developing community resilience to disaster requires people in the community to view doing so as part of their common interest in the community. It calls for socialization that encourages disaster preparedness as part of the overarching culture. When repeated natural disasters occur in an area, for instance, wildfires in California or flooding in North Carolina, a disaster culture forms. A disaster culture is a belief system about what will happen, what won't happen, and what can or cannot be done in response to the disaster. These belief systems influence how systems of response operate in that area, whether spontaneous systems of response even form, what aid they give to their communities if they do form, and how the community responds to receiving aid, and more. Poor responses from systems of response may create a disaster culture in an area that is in shock, negative, angry, distrusting, and disillusioned. If the disaster culture in an area is negative, mental health outcomes may be worse. Communities always contain both less vulnerable people who are better communities always contain both less vulnerable people who are better prepared to overcome a crisis and more vulnerable people who are less prepared to overcome a crisis. Early intervention needs to involve helping as many people in a community as possible be more prepared. Communities can improve their own response to a crisis by organizing outreach and support to those most likely to be affected by a disaster before disaster ever strikes. When a crisis occurs, responses are better structured when the social systems already exist for help to be delivered to those who are most in need already before the disaster ever gets there. Community resilience depends on members choosing to engage in collective action. Just because members of a community are independently resilient, that does not make the community as a whole resilient. In times of disaster, individuals who are very well prepared and resilient may only take care of their immediate families. This occurred during Hurricane Katrina, when police and EMS didn't show up to their shifts because they focused on the safety and well-being of their loved ones. However, if resilient individuals are already connected to their communities and in a habit of assisting other people, then in a disaster, they are more likely to act towards community well-being and not just their own. I want you to think for a minute about the kind of people who have bunkers, right? They have bunkers, they have MREs, they have the nicest first aid kit you've ever seen. Those people somehow never seem to show up for disasters, do they? No, it's people who are sticking, like they show up in their flip flops, right? They have no idea what they're doing, but they come and they help. Just because an individual is super well prepared to weather a disaster does not mean they're interconnected with their community, does not mean that they're contributing to community resiliency. And the community being resilient actually helps those people be more resilient. They don't recognize it necessarily, they don't realize that it's happening, but it actually protects them when the community is more resilient. What needs to happen is connecting very well prepared people with people who are less prepared, and having that preparation be creating a web of interconnectivity where they understand that they do better when everybody else does better. Okay. Community resilience depends on members choosing to engage in collective action. I already said that. Individual resilience is also improved by belonging to resilient communities. Individuals who are more resilient and operating in more resilient communities then build systems of interconnected collective aid, making every individual member and the community better prepared to withstand disaster. Community resilience not only prepares a community to recover, but to grow and improve. Community resilience needs to include mental health services, access to adequate nutrition, education on coping strategies, positive systems for the provision of information, and other forms of crisis preparedness training, such as FEMA's Community Emergency Response Team training, which I highly recommend everybody take. And no, I can't give it to you because I'm not a member of FEMA. I'm a member of CERT, though. This class is not on community resilience, so I'm going to try and move on pretty quickly, but how to build community resilience. Connectedness, commitment, and shared values. Connect individuals to the community, enhance commitment of community members to the community, demonstrate commitment of the community to its members, and reinforce community values. Participation. Foster individual involvement in community activities and organizations, provide opportunities for people of different backgrounds to be engaged, involve children and families in community life, increase benefits associated with community participation, improve community participation, structure roles and responsibilities, elucidate community processes, strengthen community links amongst organizations and people, develop community leadership, create equitable relationships, increase community control over program management, build empowering organizational structures, support meaningful interaction with other communities, and enhance community response to crisis. For resources, improve community resource mobilization and utilization, build social capital, provide opportunities for training and employment, develop expertise for personal and community development, enhance the resource base of the community, support community development, contribute to the long-term productive capacity of the community, instill hope amongst community members, support and nurturance, enrich existing support systems, create new support networks, and address basic human needs. Empower individual community members, build caring relationships among community members, critical reflection and skill building, contribute to the establishment of community goals and priorities, increase community problem assessment capacities, contribute to community database, support the identification, analysis, and use of data for community evaluation and improvement, encourage community members to be inquisitive, promote skill building among community members, and foster community improvement. Communication. Enhance communication among community members. Improve community member communication with service providers. Encourage community leaders to listen to community members. Strengthen community information channels. Promote the timely delivery of information. Increase the accuracy and effectiveness of community information systems. Provide opportunities for people to have problems that they can solve. Disaster prevention and mitigation, preparedness and response, contribute to disaster prevention and mitigation, enhance disaster preparedness among individuals and organizations, improve the disaster response capacity of organizations in the community, and foster recovery from disasters. Phew, that was long. This is a mutual aid center. Guess what we're doing? A lot of that. Individual resilience. As we've explored, it takes both resilient communities and resilient people in those communities working together for people to prevent poor disaster response and recover from disasters. Individual resilience isn't just important for those directly affected by disaster, it is also important for those who are responders to disasters, such as EMS, firefighters, and of course, street medics. Self care. Self care is the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's own health and well being. It is vital that people who are acting in disasters to support others not forget to take care of themselves. The success and longevity of their service to their community depends on them continuing to take care of themselves. Self care is part of how a person builds their own resiliency. Self care is not an acute practice, although there are acute things that can be done as self care after being affected by trauma or having supported someone else after they were affected by trauma. Engaging in self care isn't selfish. In an emergency on an airplane, people need to put their own masks on first, then assist others. Self care is like that. Self care helps prevent preoccupation and obsession with the pain and trauma of others, which can become so extreme that it causes traumatic stress to the responder, even if they didn't experience the trauma directly. It can prevent burnout, the state of physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion caused by prolonged stress. It also helps prevent compassion fatigue, the physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion and withdrawal experienced by those who care for traumatized people over an extended period of time. And it helps prevent re traumatization, which is re experiencing a previous traumatic event or its effects in a way that overwhelms a person's ability to cope, leading to a resurgence of symptoms similar to those experienced during the initial trauma. It also assists the responder in avoiding vicarious or secondary traumatic stress, the emotional duress that can occur when someone hears about or witnesses the trauma of someone else. Self care is important all of the time, but is particularly important when a disaster or crisis lasts for more than a day or if it involves very traumatic occurrences, such as a lot of casualties. Unfortunately, self care is a term that has been co opted by large corporations, online influencers, and a multi billion-dollar industry that has commodified taking care of one's own mental health. This often looks like using so called retail therapy to escape from dealing directly with stress by distracting from it, which can actually worsen stress, especially in those who are socioeconomically challenged. Buying bath bombs, expensive coffees, and a mimosa at lunch can be self care. I'm not telling you what to do, but it can also be a distraction from addressing the root cause of the distress. The commodification of self care can also look like being pushed and pressured into purchasing untested, unregulated supplements and other healthcare products from the wellness industry that promise to reduce cortisol and relieve stress and improve mental health. Many of these products have no verifiable health or mental health benefits. They also do not indicate contraindications or adverse effects that they may have. How many of you who suffer from any kind of mental health difficulty have had St. John's wort be recommended to you? It's extremely dangerous. There are so many contraindications for using St. John's wort, and yet it gets pushed as like a cure for mental health problems. Often, commodified self care involves services or items that one must buy. In reality, self care generally involves multiple elements, which can include physical, safety needs, meeting medical needs, eating regularly and in a way that supports one's body, sleep, etc. Psychological needs, journaling, therapy, engagement with art, time in nature, support groups, etc. Emotional needs, practicing self compassion, affirmations, meeting physical touch needs. Spiritual or religious, I don't care what you want to say, meditation, prayer, ritual, nature, music, dance. Personal, developing goals, friendships, caring for oneself financially, etc. Professional, setting boundaries around time and additional work and responsibilities, taking time off, committing to professional development. It is our opinion that the most effective parts of self care don't cost anything at all to implement. There are many things a person can do to maintain their own readiness for a stressful environment and resilience through a crisis. The first is to monitor themselves for how severely they are being emotionally impacted by what they are dealing with. Some harmful impact of what they are doing is to be expected, but it is important for the responder to monitor themselves for when those emotional and mental impacts are impairing their ability to continue their work and recover after. They can then implement the steps of stress first aid self care. More on this later. Work on balance. Not every moment can be spent assisting others, even in a crisis situation. The balance that is struck between taking care of one's own needs and the needs of others is going to vary based on the circumstances. Even during an acute crisis, the responder still needs to take time to rest, mentally and emotionally recover, eat, drink, and touch base with their own support structure. Because those moments of recovery will likely be brief and insufficient, it is even more important to have balance during the times outside of crisis. In crisis, you don't have time to do it right. So it is even more important to do it right when you can, so that when crisis hits, you're better prepared to weather it. Have a support system. We've already covered that a community is more resilient when it contains interconnected, resilient people. We've also stressed the importance of early intervention. Responders should ideally have a support system already in place before going into a traumatic environment. That support system should exist outside of the disaster and exist for them when the crisis has passed. However, it is also important to have a support system in place during the crisis itself. This can look like utilizing the buddy system, which can help with monitoring as well. A buddy can help the responder know when they are starting to respond to the stress in an unhealthy or harmful fashion. They can also help the responder with their balance, reminding them to step away and take care of themselves. Sometimes you need somebody else to be like, go eat something, go drink something. You are not responding in your best way. You're hurting yourself and others. Go take a break. The greater community of responders can also be a support system during times of crisis. Shared times without reliving trauma together can be very important for maintaining good mental and emotional balance during a disaster. This can be done with shared meal times or relaxation times with storytelling and music sharing. It would be our recommendation that this not turn into a CISD, but instead be a chance for everyone working together to unwind and connect over something other than their shared trauma. After the crisis is passed, it is important for the responder to connect with their normal support system, whether that includes family, friends, community, a mental health provider, etc. Sleep. Inadequate sleep directly impacts emotional regulation. This makes a person's response to traumatic circumstances worse. Acute stress disorder or PTSD can worsen sleep, especially if the person is experiencing hyperarousal. Yes.
You're mentioning CISD and the group circle elements of it, with everybody sharing trauma. How
Yes.
much is there an overlap between that being unhealthy and venting to somebody about your personal struggles?
Ooh, it really depends on how that person responds. Um, it's a myth that venting is always good. There's this idea that if you vent anger, anger decreases, and studies have not actually borne that out. Or if you vent trauma, trauma decreases. It depends on how you vent, and it depends on how a person responds to you venting. Now, individual therapy methodologies like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, they can actually teach you to vent in a productive way. I'm not kidding. There is actually productive venting and non-productive venting. There's venting that helps you, and there's venting that hurts you. And you can learn to do the venting that helps you. But also, it depends on who you're venting to. Because if you're venting to someone who responds really poorly, they say, get over it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you're not acting like a man, you're crazy. Um, they invalidate you, or they actually like encourage you to give into unhealthy coping mechanisms like substance use, etc. Well, then that venting can be very harmful. But if instead you listen to someone and they're like, wow, that sucks, that's awful, man, I'm so sorry you're going through that, is there anything I can do to support you? Well, there you go. That's a better person to vent to. And I recommend that as you build your support circle, you focus on finding the people who go, could I maybe make some meals, drop them off at your house? Could I come take a walk with you? Instead of someone who's like, well, I'll bring over a bottle of vodka. Okay, there's different people respond different ways. Is that helpful? Cool. Moving on. PTSD and ASD, acute stress disorder, worsen sleep, especially if the person has experienced hyperarousal or re experiencing trauma through their nightmares. And then not getting enough sleep can worsen acute stress disorder and PTSD in a vicious cycle. We will get into acute stress disorder here in a minute. It may be difficult to sleep during a crisis, in that there literally may not be enough time to sleep, and a responder may need to function on less than is optimal for them to do so. Therefore, it is even more important that a responder get adequate sleep before they are in a crisis. They should practice good sleep hygiene and try to maintain a regular sleep schedule so that when a crisis hits, they are better prepared to deal with it. During the crisis, they should be sure to sleep when they can. Okay, I know it's hard. I'm talking to you from experience here. Sleep when you can. It is not irresponsible to take time to sleep, it is vital. Studies have shown that staying awake for just 17 to 19 hours straight impacts performance more than a blood alcohol level of 0.05%, which is the level at which a person is considered legally drunk in most Western European countries, and which slows an individual's response time by about 50% compared to someone who is well rested. 24 hours of continuous wakefulness induces impairments of the same degree as a blood alcohol level of 0.1%, so beyond the legal limit for alcohol intoxication in the United States. At one point, I was responding to a disaster 32 hours awake. The world was vibrating. I could hear people's voices in my teeth. Do you think I was responding at my best? No, I needed to leave. I needed to go rest, but this is when I was young and stupid. I shouldn't use the word stupid. This is when I was young and not as well educated about this as I am now. Okay, exercise. This is not at all intended as an ableist statement. We are well aware that people have varying abilities to exercise, and we are not stating that exercise can cure a mental health problem, condition, syndrome, or disorder. I am a disabled person. I still try to move my body when I can. Studies have consistently demonstrated that regular physical activity can reduce the risk of developing depression and anxiety, reduce the severity of the symptoms of depression and anxiety, reduce stress, and improve memory, attention, and overall cognition. This does not mean that responders need to spend hours in the gym to function. For mental health benefits, moderate exercise for 30 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week has been found to be sufficient. And those 30 minutes don't have to be all at once. It can be split up into 10-minute chunks with rests in between. You can do 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes on your lunch break, 10 minutes in the evening, and do that 3 to 5 times a week. During a crisis, responders are often either far more physically active than normal or have no time for exercise while sitting for long hours. And for some reason, it's basically one or the other. I don't know why that is. I don't know why it's either you're like running around for 14 hours and you barely had time to sit down, or you were sitting on your butt in a tent for like 16 hours, but it seems to be one or the other. At least that's my experience. Taking a few minutes for slow, deliberate stretches when possible can help with both extremes. Stretching has been clinically demonstrated to increase serotonin levels. Serotonin is the hormone that helps stabilize our mood, reduce stress, and decrease the symptoms of depression and anxiety. Stay hydrated. No, drinking enough water will not cure acute stress disorder or PTSD. However, studies have found that dehydration has negative mental health effects due to changes in brain chemistry, including reduced levels of serotonin and dopamine. Water also maintains the balance of electrolytes in the brain, which are essential for neurotransmitter function. Dehydration can also increase levels of cortisol, which can contribute to anxiety and depression. Adequate hydration also supports the release of hormones that help with mental health, like oxytocin. Staying hydrated can help reduce symptoms of stress, anxiety, and depression. Dehydration can also impair cognition, making it harder to stay focused and to solve problems. There isn't a set amount of water that everyone needs to drink, despite the insistence from many people that everyone requires 8 glasses of water a day. Instead, responders should pay attention to their bodies. The first sign of dehydration is thirst. If they are thirsty, they should drink water. In cases of crisis where water is unsafe to drink, it is important for responders to still stay hydrated. They can seek out donated water, carry a LifeStraw water filter or a LifeStraw water bottle to purify water for themselves, or carry water purifying tablets and obviously know how to use them. Like, don't carry them if you don't know how to use them. But there are instructions on the package. Anyway, eat. The first part of eating as self-care is just to remember to eat. In crisis, people skip meals. It actually has to do with how our body responds to crisis, where it sometimes shuts down digestion. But as soon as you're away from the really acute stress, it is important to eat. And sometimes those first couple bites need to be taken before you feel the hunger, and then the hunger will kick in as you eat. I know that sounds odd, but it's true. Okay, getting adequate calories is vital for good mental health. Restrictive diets and inadequate calories increase symptoms of anxiety and depression. Human bodies rely on a combination of vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, fats, carbohydrates, and protein for healthy neurotransmitter and hormone function. Inadequate fuel can cause neurotransmitter and hormone dysfunction, worsen stress, and degrade cognitive function. We do not recommend that any responders follow restrictive diet unless it is indicated by another health condition such as diabetes. Like if you have fibromyalgia and you have to cut back on carbs to manage your inflammation, okay. If you have diabetes and you need to avoid certain levels of glucose, okay. I'm not saying disregard the advice of your doctor. I'm saying otherwise, if you are going to be a responder in times of crisis, you cannot be doing restrictive dieting. Instead, we recommend that if possible, they eat a whole food diet based on as few ultra processed foods as possible. This can be expensive. This can be time consuming. So there's a kind of a do the best you can do thing here. There are no good foods, there are no bad foods. And so they should aim to eat enough and from a diverse range of foods so they get enough of important micronutrients. While in crisis mode, it is easy to skip a few meals and not even realize it. Adequate nutrition may help reduce the symptoms of acute stress disorder by regulating neurotransmitters, reducing inflammation, and providing essential nutrients for brain function. In order for acute stress disorder not to devolve towards PTSD, responders have to eat. We recommend that they keep easy to eat, calorie dense foods in their packs while dealing with any disaster. These foods can include nuts, protein bars, fruit leather, jerky, and trail mix. They are likely to be ultra processed foods, which ensure their portability and their longevity. Unfortunately, that may be necessary for a few days while the crisis is ongoing. They should seek out fresh produce and less processed meals when they can fit it in or when it becomes available. This is also why having someone cooking high nutrient, energy dense meals at base camps is so vital for the health and functioning of a group of responders. Taking the time to go back to base camp, sit with other responders, and decompress over a filling and satiating meal that isn't ultra processed can be extremely valuable, both for the nutrition and for the community support break. Not everyone's gonna be a medic. Not everybody can carry somebody else. Not everybody can set a broken bone without freaking out. Not, which you should not be doing anyway. Let me use a different example. Not everybody can splint a broken bone without freaking out. Not everybody can pack a bleeding wound. They're going to pass out at the sight of the blood. We need supports because that's how we continue to function. And one of the things that people can do is be base camp. Setting up food, setting up water, setting up places for people to wrap a blanket around themselves and rest. That's what we need. Okay. Practice firm boundaries. We recommend that responders take classes in boundary setting, even if they think they are already very good at it. A lot of people who think they're very good at setting boundaries are not actually setting boundaries. They're just being mean to people around them. They don't actually mean the same thing. Firm boundaries are essential for mental health. They can reduce overwork, stress, mental and emotional exhaustion, burnout, compassion fatigue, and the likeliness of being trapped in a situation where the individual is going to experience vicarious trauma. To establish firm boundaries, it is first essential to know what boundaries an individual wants to have. This requires that they establish their own needs and limits, which requires some degree of self-examination. You do kind of have to get to know yourself as you're going through this. Dialectical behavioral therapy can help someone who is struggling to determine boundaries, clearly communicate them, and reinforce them when a person attempts to violate them. Boundaries can be clearly asserted using I statements, such as, I will not allow myself to be treated this way. I require this time to recover and am not available to help. It is also important to be able to say no and stick to it. No, I can't roll out with you this time. No, I'm not going to go into that building. It's going to collapse. No, I'm not going to eat that. I'm going to go eat the thing that I know will help me. No, I don't want the alcohol you're offering me right now. I need to be focused on what I'm doing, that kind of thing. It can be helpful to have a no list, which is a list of things the responder will not do that they are familiar with in advance. Get recommended routine medical care. Responders to disasters come in all degrees of physical ability and disability. Some are extremely healthy individuals, and some of them are chronically ill. Hello, I'm chronically ill. Okay? Regardless, responders should attempt to address routine medical needs such as vaccinations. If responders do not have health insurance, this can be extremely difficult. They should try to find free or sliding scale clinics and visit when they can. They should also see a mental health provider if they can. Responders to disasters, especially those dealing with trauma, PTSD, or CPTSD, should consider seeking qualified mental health professional. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, called TFCBT, is the recommended first-line treatment for acute stress disorder, as it can alleviate symptoms before it ever develops into PTSD. Meditate. Meditation may help some responders with their mental health issues. However, it is often recommended to all responders as kind of a one-size-fits-all solution. Meditation may actually be harmful to some people. I know it's weird to have a witch tell you that. I do know this. I've had this argument, okay? But I am standing here as a witch, as a member of clergy, to tell you that not everybody should meditate. It's not recommended for people with untreated PTSD, people who are struggling with severe trauma responses, people with severe active depression, active suicidal ideation, or active psychosis. Mindfulness meditation is additionally contraindicated for all the same, like all of those, as well as obsessive compulsive disorder and borderline personality disorder outside of the context of dialectical behavioral therapy, which actually does do mindfulness specifically for borderline personality disorder, but it does it in a very precise way. And no, I'm not trained in doing it. And substance use issues. Recently, we've seen somatic breathing exercises be recommended in combination with meditation to active responders to climate disaster. It is also not recommended for people with certain health conditions, including cardiovascular conditions, high blood pressure, epilepsy, and dysautonomia, or people with active psychosis or who have bipolar disorder. Did I put up there that there was a rant here? I don't know if I have time for the rant. I'm trying to get through a lot of notes today. If we have time at the end, somebody ask me about this rant. That is your assignment. Somebody ask me, and I'll do it at the end. All that is to say that meditation may help some people, but not all people, as a form of self-care. Keep a journal. A journal is a private and non-judgmental space to process trauma and gain clarity on thoughts and feelings. It can be helpful for acute stress disorder, PTSD, and CPTSD. However, it can also lead to some degree of re-traumatization, depending on how the journal is being used. Some mental health providers can assist with dialectical behavioral therapy, journaling for PTSD and CPTSD through specific exercises and prompts, which are geared towards processing and recovering from trauma rather than from re-triggering it. Just asking, can you think of a way that journaling might actually trigger you or re-traumatize you? Exactly. If you are just taking a journal and you're spilling out all the details of everything horrific, and then you're starting to have that flashback and you're trying to get all those details out, because that's what people tell you. They're like, if you write it all down, it'll get it out of your head. It actually can reinforce it. So it really depends on how you journal. Okay? Maintain your spiritual practices or religious, whatever you want to say. If a responder has religious or spiritual practices that are part of their everyday life and routine, they should do their best to keep to them during times of crisis. Not only can they be a source of comfort, but abandoning them during a time of acute stress will only increase the level of associated trauma. Rituals provide normalcy, and being able to maintain a level of normalcy during times of crisis is incredibly beneficial. Additionally, spiritual practices may help by allowing the responder to engage with established rituals surrounding grief and loss, as well as accessing sources of meaning during disaster. Contrariwise, be on the lookout for opportunistic and unscrupulous religious or spiritual groups that will attempt to prey upon those who are already traumatized in order to grow their own members. How many of you have responded to disaster before and the churches turn up? Anybody? Okay, I got one person with her hand up. Sometimes the churches are like, here's food and water. Sometimes the churches are like, come to services for food and water. Which of these is opportunistic and predatory? There we go. They do it with the unhoused too. Have a good night. Have a sense of purpose. Research has found that strong sense of purpose may be the single most important factor in determining mental health outcomes following a serious trauma. One study of 259 individuals exposed to at least one severe traumatic event found that having a purpose in life was the key predictor of a trauma-exposed individual's ability to maintain a baseline mental health status and recover from psychiatric illness. A strong sense of purpose predating trauma exposure promoted resiliency, and regaining a sense of purpose was central to recovery after a trauma. Mastery, which is a strong sense of control over one's life, was also significantly associated with recovered status. A sense of purpose was found to be more effective at preventing negative mental health outcomes after trauma than having a strong social network of support. Everybody stresses have a social network, have a social network, have people you can lean on for support. But the best predictor of recovery is having a sense of purpose. Okay? I have one. I can tell you what it is. It's kind of odd. I've tried to explain it to people before. Yen gets it. He always gets it, which is that I think there's a great big lie that's being told to people. And I think it has lies that reinforce it. And I think that people chain themselves up to these lies because they're promised that they'll get something out of it. And I have made it my life's purpose, my guiding star, the thing that keeps me walking no matter how many times my life burns down, to break as many of those chains as possible. That's mine. Okay? Stress first aid. Stress first aid is a self-care and peer support model originally developed for those in high-risk occupations. It is designed to address signs of stress reactions in oneself and in others. A foundational part of the stress first aid model is the stress continuum model, which was developed as a way to assess a person's level of stress response. The basic premise is that stress responses are on a continuum and spectrum of severity. Everyone will react when faced with stress, but their response will fall somewhere on the continuum based on their own resiliency. Stress reactions can move back and forth on a spectrum and occur in a nonlinear fashion. The continuum is divided into 4 colors. During extreme stress, someone will also switch between colors quite quickly. Can you go to the next slide, my love? This is the stress continuum. Okay, that's what it looks like. Generally, people are somewhere in the green zone, and then they encounter a stressor, any kind of stressor. That can be they didn't sleep enough. That can be they're worried about a work project. That can be they have a tension headache. They didn't eat well. That's a stressor, right? Even I'm just not having a good time is the yellow. Then you move into orange, which is more severe and persistent distress or impairment. And this is where you start getting into higher risk. This is where people are experiencing panic, anxiety, rage, depression. They don't feel like their normal self. This also includes time when the people are suffering with a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, and it can actually lead to moving into the ill point. But this is where someone is mentally injured, and generally is caused by a threat to their life, a loss or bereavement, an inner conflict, or excess wear and tear. And then moving into red, we have persistent and disabling distress and loss of function. This is also clinical mental disorders that are in an active state, right? So this is not managed mental disorders. This is something that is flaring, okay? Unhealed stress injuries, and this includes PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and other mental issues. So acute stress disorder is somewhere overlapping the injured and the ill, right? It's where you're moving from I'm stressed out to I am ill, okay? Acute stress disorder could be like orange red, red orange. Got it? The stigma associated with mental health difficulties can lead people to hide their issues and delay getting help. People are often ashamed to discuss what they're going through and worried about what people will think of them. According to the Americans Mental Health 2018 study, nearly 1/3 of Americans have worried about others judging them when they revealed that they sought mental health services, and over 1/5 of Americans have lied to avoid revealing that they either have been or will be in treatment, or that they are in treatment. People will sometimes conceal stress reactions because of the external and internalized stigma around mental health issues. This is unfortunate, as early intervention may prevent someone from worsening and help them recover faster on the continuum. 4 types of stress are the most likely to move someone further on the continuum, causing them to enter into the orange or red zones. These are life-threatening situations, like a disaster crisis, loss of a loved one, home, job, role, able body, etc., like during a disaster crisis, inner conflict, and wear and tear, which is the accumulation of long-term stress. A responder could literally be having all of these at once during a crisis. Inner conflict includes any conflict between a person's beliefs and ethics and their current circumstances. Commonly in the responder community, it includes conflict over being unable to help more or prevent harm to others, or being very, very angry at the systems of response. That's where you're going to see a lot of internal conflict in responders. Stress first aid has 5 elements: safety, cover, calming, connectedness, self-efficacy, which is competence, and hope, which is confidence. If a person is exhibiting persistent orange zone reactions, then 2 additional elements are added, which are check and coordinate. We're going to start with check and coordinate because those are the ones that are really vital if someone is really flaring into stress. You're looking at acute stress disorder and you're going, shit, 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 gotta help. The check element instructs the responder to monitor themselves and others for signs of stress. Common stress reactions include increase or decrease in activity, increase or decrease in appetite, changes in sleep routine, which is sleeping too much, sleeping too little, headache, chest pain, gastrointestinal problems, nausea, vomiting, pain, diarrhea, bad dreams, fatigue, nervousness, irritability, anger and frustration, numbness and apathy, loss of willpower, confusion and difficulty making decisions, racing thoughts, shock, fearfulness and horror, helplessness, loss of faith, feelings of abandonment, feelings of detachment, feelings of being out of control, disillusionment, feelings of always being on alert or on guard, isolation, conflict with others, derealization, dissociation, distortion of time and space, despair, substance use, acute stress disorder symptoms, post-traumatic stress symptoms, and depression or anxiety symptoms. Responders may additionally have other signs of too much stress: compassion fatigue, demoralization, alienation, resignation, preoccupation with re-experiencing trauma, compulsive re-triggering, attempts to over-control crisis situations, overwork, and unnecessary risk-taking. Some people feel uncomfortable checking in with others about their stress. They may find that the Oscar model is helpful, which has 5 steps. This is observe, state observations, clarify role, ask why, and respond. If a responder has observed that a person is exhibiting signs of stress or that they have been through a period of stress, they can approach them and ask how they're doing. This is the observe state. You have observed. Then they can state their observation. If they're brushed off with a quick response such as "I'm fine," then they can state those observations. Observations can include a statement that someone has been going through a stressful time and or what signs of stress the responder has noticed. They can then clarify their role, which can help prevent defensiveness. A role someone could list would be friend, family member, member of a shared community, medic, or even just "I'm a concerned person and I want to help." If the person acknowledges that they've been stressed, the next step is to ask why. It is important to listen non-judgmentally. When listening, it is important to set aside judgments about the other person, their situation, their choices, and how they are expressing themselves. Most people experiencing stress want to feel heard before being offered advice or resources. The most important attitudes to have with non-judgmental listening are acceptance, genuineness, and empathy. Acceptance means respecting the person's background, culture, personal values, experiences, and feelings. The responder should not criticize, trivialize, dismiss, or deny what someone is expressing to them. They should not conclude that someone is weak, lazy, or crazy because they are struggling with stress. Genuineness means not holding in one set of attitudes while expressing another. People can tell when they are receiving false sympathy or when someone is outwardly expressing non-judgment while judging them internally. A responder should not exaggerate their empathy in their expression, but instead display some genuine compassion. Reach deep. Get to genuine compassion. Give a fuck, then help someone. Empathy means attempting to truly connect with the person and understand what they're experiencing. However, the responder should avoid over empathizing to the point where they experience vicarious trauma. The responder should also not say, "I understand what you're going through." Each person's experience, even of the exact same situation, will be unique. It is important to do this while not interrupting. It is also important sometimes to ask gentle clarifying questions or use verbal expressions to indicate continued interest. Some gaps and silences are normal, as it can take a while for someone to find the right words to express themselves. The responder should avoid arguing with people. The final step is to respond to what someone has expressed. This can be with statements that make it clear that what they shared was heard and understood. It can also include a follow-up plan such as, "May I check in with you in a couple days?" or "Would you like to make plans to meet up again in a week?" If the person chooses not to share with the responder or refuses to acknowledge the problem or share the source, the responder should ask if they can check on the person later, and then actually check in. Don't say, "I'd like to check on you later," and then just abandon someone, okay? If the person expresses they are struggling with wanting to stay alive or continue existing, it is best to ask them directly if they are thinking of killing themselves. If they say yes, the responder needs to ask if they have made a plan to kill themselves. If they say yes, the responder needs to ask if they have acquired what they need to act on that plan. If they say yes, the responder needs to call 911. In the state of North Carolina, all adults over 18 are mandatory reporters if someone says they have intention to hurt themselves or hurt others. I'm going to just really quickly, and I don't have a lot of time, I'm already worried about running over, tell you all that it is a myth that if you ask someone directly if they are considering committing suicide, you have then put that thought in their head, that they weren't having that thought and you are then responsible for introducing it to them. That is a myth, okay? And yes, sometimes people do respond defensively or with anger or upset to being asked directly if they intend to kill themselves, but you still need to ask using very blunt and very direct language. Even using the phrase, "Do you want to kill yourself?" rather than, "Are you considering doing yourself some harm?" can actually help prevent suicide because the person didn't contextualize it necessarily as killing a person. They thought of it as, "I don't want to be here anymore." Okay? Don't prevaricate, ask directly with blunt, clear words. Clear? Okay. Mental health first aid will go into that in a lot more detail than I have time for tonight. Coordinate. The coordinate action involves getting someone the help they need. This can include gentle referrals to professional resources, including local support organizations or mental health providers. It can also involve coordinating assistance with other responders in an area to take work off the person's shoulders, cover for them while they recover, or be there to support them with things like meals, company, etc. It can be somewhat tricky to coordinate without violating someone's privacy, so the responder should do their best to always get consent before sharing information and then share as little as possible, such as, so and so is going through a really rough time. I'd like us to do blank to support them. Okay? And then actually follow through. Cover. The cover action involves ensuring ongoing safety, both for oneself and for others, which can be through a momentary action that increases a sense of stability and security, or a longer, far reaching commitment to ongoing action to ensure it. Some of the cover action is quite literally about being safe rather than feeling safe. The safety of the responder is paramount, as is the safety of the person they may be trying to assist. They need to leave areas of imminent danger before implementing the rest of these actions. They can then focus on what makes someone feel safer. People have different ways of feeling safe. Some people associate safety with a person, a parent, a guardian, a caretaker, a lover, a partner, a spouse, etc., a place, a home, the mountains, the beach, or an action, taking a walk, breathing deeply, relaxing tense muscles. For oneself, it can help to know in advance of a crisis what makes the responder feel safe. This may be people they can contact, places they can go, or actions they can take that restore their sense of stability. For others, a responder can ask gently and directly what they can do to assist someone in feeling safe when they are stressed or during a crisis. When there is a disaster, it may be that they cannot find the people who make them feel safe, and it is unlikely that a person can just leave and go to where they may feel safe, so the first aid may have to focus on actions that can restore a sense of safety. This often involves treatment for psychological shock and trauma, such as keeping a person warm, helping them with their breathing, etc. Calm. The calm action is intended to reduce the intensity of the stress. The cover and calm actions kind of overlap, but the cover actions are specifically focused on safety, while the calm actions are about taking action to soothe the ramped up reactions to stress. Part of the calm action is preventative. If the responder has dedicated part of their everyday life to pursuing calm, they have the emotional reserve to draw upon in times of crisis and to return to when the crisis is past. This may look like regular physical activity, walking, running, yoga, martial arts, etc., spending time with loved ones, and spending time in the community, hobbies, listening to music, reading, creating art, or mental and spiritual practices like meditation and prayer. The responder should have an idea of what they can do to calm themselves down before they're in a crisis, so they can implement calming techniques when emergencies arise. They can also have a pre-constructed calming routine that they can put themselves through when they feel their stress levels escalating. We're going to be doing boundary training at some point for RUMA staff coming up. That's going to focus partially on pre-constructed calming routines. How do you calm yourself down? Okay? When assisting someone else, they can ask them what normally helps them calm down and see if there's a way to implement it. They can also gently provide skills and self-coping strategies that can help. They can also provide aid for panic attacks, more on this later if we have time. Sometimes there is nothing they can do to help someone calm down, but be present and listen non-judgmentally. Connect. The connect action in stress first aid is intended to provide support for the responder or the persons that they are assisting. For the responder, this can look like building connections with their local community in advance of disasters, having a support structure of family, friends, partner, or partners, and knowing what local resources are available to them when they are struggling. When in crisis, they can then focus on connecting with that support to restore their mental and emotional equilibrium. For someone the responder is trying to assist, this can look like helping a person identify and connect with their local community, know what resources are available for them in their area, or helping them feel encouraged to reach out for help from their support system. Competence. The competence action in stress first aid is intended to build and or restore a person's capacity to function. It is meant to help a person have a sense of self-efficiency and resiliency. For an individual responder, the competence action can involve pre-disaster steps of learning coping strategies, learning skills that help them be prepared for disasters, learning and doing things that give them a sense of accomplishment, and working on building a sense of purpose. During a crisis, they can reflect on the satisfaction of the work they are doing to help others and the sense of achievement and conviction they have while doing it. For a person the responder is assisting, competence may look like giving the person a task to focus on so that they can feel more in control. The task should be something where if they make a mistake doing it, it won't be a big deal or cause injury to anybody else. You can be like, would you like to hand out water bottles? That's generally a thing that a person can do and distract themselves with that isn't going to involve them hurting themselves. It can also look like reassuring them that they are human, that their reactions are acceptable and understandable in the context of disaster, and that they are capable of overcoming it. Confidence. The confidence action of stress first aid involves helping build hope for the future. Feeling hopeless, worthless, and or useless is very dangerous for people who are already in a crisis. The confidence action involves building up self-esteem and promoting realistic hope. It can also involve having a sense of purpose, but specifically a sense of purpose that helps a person feel confident that they can handle what the future holds. For themselves, a responder can use small accomplishments and triumphs to build up their confidence. They can use their experience of disasters and crises to reaffirm their own skills and the sense of personal value. For supporting others, a responder should avoid causing self-doubt by criticizing, castigating, or taking their own stress out on others when they make a mistake. They can gently encourage confidence by pointing out successes. They can encourage people to feel capable of taking on small tasks during a disaster or crisis and tell them they have done a good job when they have. I'm going to note here that I have accidentally found out quite often that responders I'm working with have a praise kink. Ask me how that happens. Okay? I tell people, good job. Thanks. You did great. I'm proud of you. And I say it often. I say it so often that my son's teachers actually told me that he was then saying it often to people, and they wanted to know why. They were like, why does your kid always tell other kids that they're doing a good job or that he's proud of them? I was like, is that a problem? Is that bad? Why are you telling me about this? Okay. Encouraging hope does not look like telling people that their disaster or crisis was a lesson from a divine power, has a silver lining, or that they will be stronger for having endured it. It does not involve making false promises. I promise you, you're going to get through this. Don't tell that to somebody. You don't fucking know. Okay? Don't tell someone, you should be grateful that this happened to you because you'll be stronger for it in the future. Okay? Helping someone have hope for the future does not look like saying, for every cloud, there is a silver lining. I'm sure you'll look back at this someday and be glad you went through it because you're a stronger person now. No, that's not what I mean. Telling someone, I think that you're capable of getting through this. I think you've got the strength in you. I believe in you. Do you hear the difference between those? Okay, excellent. The stress first aid model stresses that there isn't a specific correct time for a person to push themselves to process their stress, such as sometimes recommended in the CISD model, but rather that there should be a continuous monitoring of stress levels and that the person should take the time to make sense of what they're feeling, feel what they're feeling, acknowledge what they're feeling, restore their equilibrium, and then continue functioning as best they can. What to do? If something does trigger them, a person should give themselves time and space to think about it, confront it, accept it, experience the emotions it brings out of them, and move forward without feeling pressured to make sense of it or getting stuck in the suffering. A person should find tasks and activities they will feel successful at. A person should acknowledge their personal victories and capabilities. A person should reaffirm their own sense of purpose and conviction. A person should take hope in the promises and commitments they have made and see the good that they do in the world. A person should look for hope in the future. A person should cultivate that sense of hope and build on it with plans for the future. A person should seek help from their support structure if they need it. A person should seek help from a professional if they need it. What not to do? After a trauma, a person shouldn't push themselves to process the trauma within a specific time frame. This is one of the major problems with CISD. There's this idea that there's this specific time frame that you have to sit and process your trauma in. That's not true, okay? After a trauma, a person should not be pushed into sharing their trauma with others or vicariously experiencing the trauma of others in a non-therapeutically guided debriefing or talking group. A person should not feel guilty for their reaction to stress. Stress reactions are normal. Everyone has them. A person should not keep it a secret if they are struggling. A person should not keep it a secret if they are feeling hopeless. A person should not keep it a secret if they are considering killing themselves. Acute stress disorder. After a trauma, people frequently experience the signs of stress, along with autonomic dysregulation. Autonomic dysregulation refers to the nervous system being stuck in a state of heightened alertness or a shutdown response after a traumatic event, disrupting the ability to recover. According to a study published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, Dan Siegel's window of tolerance model of autonomic arousal suggests that there is a normal range of optimal autonomic arousal in which people tolerate their emotions and integrate their experiences, even when they're traumatic. On either end of that window, the spectrum of autonomic function, are states of emotional dysregulation, hypoarousal and hyperarousal. Hyperarousal and hypoarousal are both dysregulated states, but on opposite ends of the spectrum. However, they are both triggered by the stress response. I want to note here, and I'll just note it again at the end of this when we get through it, it is a myth that you can only be in hyperarousal or hypoarousal at the same time. You can actually be experiencing both and have symptoms of both at the same time because they are from two different portions of your nervous system, both of which can be activated during trauma. Okay? Not like you're picking which one is active. Everyone understand? All right. Hyperarousal is caused by an overactive sympathetic nervous system. This is your activation and arousal response. The symptoms include hypervigilance, fear, irritability, anger, anxiety, reactivity, racing thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, high risk behavior, trouble sleeping, being easily startled, being really tense, having a fast heart rate, shallow, quick breathing, high blood pressure, high levels of cortisol, and high levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline. Hypoarousal is due to an overactive parasympathetic, your rest and digest nervous response. The symptoms can include brain fog, fatigue, sleepiness, cravings for caffeine, alcohol, or drugs, trouble focusing, numbness, emptiness, dissociation, feelings of helplessness or hopelessness, shutting down emotionally, a depressed mood, irregular heartbeat, shallow and irregular breathing, digestive system issues, and sensitivity to cold. As I said, you can have these at the same time. You can swing back and forth between these. In fact, that's actually pretty common during crisis, is that you kind of like ping around. And you can have symptoms from both ends of the spectrum. Acute stress disorder. Some people have a wider window of tolerance naturally, while others develop one over time as they work to do so as part of developing their own resiliency. High levels of stress and dysregulation are very common after a disaster, especially in the first few weeks after a traumatic experience. Although acute stress reactions are common, they are also generally brief. Most people recover over the following months without ever developing PTSD. The available evidence is that the response to most people have to trauma is to initially experience a range of what we would consider PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder, but recover in the following months. Disaster research on how many people develop PTSD after a disaster has established that anywhere between 4% for natural disasters to 34% for terrorist attacks will actually develop PTSD from a traumatic event. Acute stress disorder is the term for the initial traumatic stress reactions following trauma. There is some debate as to whether the diagnosis is meant to identify people who are more likely to develop PTSD or whether it describes a transient reaction that most people have in the initial 48 hours after a trauma. The ICD-10 describes acute stress reaction as a spectrum of anxious and depressive trauma responses that may or may not develop into PTSD. But the diagnosis of acute stress reaction was moved to the ICD-11 section as factors influencing health status because the reactions are normal and they generally resolve, allowing the person to recover and return to their everyday life. I have met a lot of responders who are only aware of the ICD-10 idea of this, where it always means that someone is at risk of developing PTSD and you have to intervene. Whereas actually it's a very normal response and most people recover okay. The DSM-5 describes acute stress disorder as a trauma and stressor-related disorder. A. Exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing the traumatic event, witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others, learning that the event occurred to a close family member or close friend. Note, in cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the event must have been violent or accidental. Experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of a traumatic death or traumatic event, e.g., first responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse. Note, this does not apply to exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures unless this exposure is work-related. I emphatically disagree with that, by the way. I absolutely believe that someone can give themselves PTSD just by spending too much time in certain corners of the internet. But I am not a mental health professional who gets to argue with the DSM-5. Presence of 9 or more of the following symptoms from any of the 5 categories of intrusion, negative mood, dissociation, avoidance, and arousal, beginning or worsening after the traumatic events occurred. The intrusion symptoms are recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic events. Note, in children, repetitive play may occur in which themes of aspects of the traumatic events occurred. Recurrent distressing dreams in which the content or effect of the dream are related to the events. Note, in children, there may be frightening dreams without recognizing the content of them. Dissociative reactions, e.g., flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic events were recurring. Such reactions may occur on a continuum, with the most extreme expression being a complete loss of awareness of present surroundings. Note, in children, trauma-specific reenactment can occur in play. Intense or prolonged psychological distress or marked physiological reactions in response to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events. Negative mood, persistent inability to experience positive emotions, inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. Dissociative symptoms, an altered sense of the reality of one's surroundings or oneself, seeing oneself from another's perspective, being in a daze, time slowing down. Inability to remember an important aspect of the traumatic events, typically due to dissociative amnesia and not to other factors such as head injury, alcohol, or drugs. Like if somebody knocked their head in the trauma and thus can't remember the trauma, that's not the same as acute stress disorder. Avoidance symptoms, efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic events. Efforts to avoid external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, and situations that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic events. Arousal symptoms, sleep disturbance, difficulty falling or staying asleep, restless sleep, irritable behavior, and angry outbursts with little or no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects, hypervigilance, problems with concentration, and exaggerated startle response. Duration of the disturbance. Symptoms have to last 3 days to 1 month after trauma exposure for it to count as acute stress disorder. Symptoms typically begin immediately after the trauma, but persistence for at least 3 days and up to a month is needed to meet the disorder criteria. The disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, and the disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance, like a medication or alcohol, or another medical condition, like a mild traumatic brain injury, and is not better explained by brief psychotic disorder. So if somebody has disaster-related psychosis, that is not considered acute stress disorder. If the symptoms persist for longer than 4 weeks, a person would likely then be diagnosed as having PTSD instead of acute stress disorder. Many mental health professionals have criticized the diagnostic criteria of acute stress disorder. Two of the primary criticisms, beyond the fact that there wasn't enough research put into the creation of the diagnostic criteria, which I think improved between the DSM 4 and the DSM 5, are that not everyone experiences dissociative symptoms as a response to trauma, and they can still develop PTSD without it, and that it unnecessarily pathologizes a healthy response to traumatic events. This is reflected in ICD-11's changes. A review of multiple studies has found that approximately 3/4 of survivors of traumatic events who met the criteria for acute stress disorder eventually developed PTSD. However, when looking at it from the other direction, most people who developed PTSD did not meet the criteria for acute stress disorder. So acute stress disorder as diagnosed may be a good predictor for PTSD, but developing PTSD does not depend upon first having met the criteria for having acute stress disorder. The reason many people who developed PTSD did not meet the criteria for ASD according to the DSM-4 is that they didn't have the 3 dissociative symptoms. Harvey and Byron found that 60% of people who met all the criteria for acute stress disorder diagnosis, except for the dissociation cluster, met the criteria for PTSD diagnosis 6 months later. Then 75% of those still had PTSD 2 years later. The DSM-5 updated its criteria for acute stress disorder to reflect this, and it no longer requires dissociation for a diagnosis. So why do I even have that information about the DSM-4 in there if that's not what's being used by mental health professionals? How many responders do you think are mental health professionals? Not many. And a lot of them have attended mental health trainings, stress first aid, psychological first aid, and they were told it's only acute stress disorder if someone is dissociating, because that's what the DSM-4 said. Except that turned into a huge debate, and it was eventually removed. You don't have to have disassociation to have acute stress disorder. That is not accurate, and the vast majority of people who seem to present with acute stress disorder and go on to have PTSD don't have every single symptom. They have some of the symptoms, which may or may not include dissociation, because not everyone disassociates. Some do, but not everyone. And dissociative responses can occur in any situation where there is an increased autonomic dysregulation, regardless of whether there is an active disaster or crisis going on. Some level of dissociation is a normal, adaptive, resilient response to traumatic events, and it protects the individual from noticing, recording, and integrating details of a crisis into their memory. We dissociate sometimes so that we don't remember everything that happened. And so then sitting down with someone who's like, you have to remember every detail of your trauma right now, within the first 3 days of experiencing it. That's how you're going to not get PTSD, is that you have to sit with me and remember every detail of what happened. Do you think that helps? Why would that maybe not help? Okay. Who is more likely to develop PTSD? It's difficult to know what a person's window of tolerance is. It's difficult to know when they are exhibiting the normal signs of stress during a disaster, crisis, or trauma, and when they are transitioning into acute stress disorder. It's hard to recognize who will be resilient and adapt and who will transition into PTSD. There are a few signs that someone can watch for in themselves and others. Persistent dissociation that goes on for weeks or months is a concern because it may indicate that someone is avoiding, recognizing, accepting, and recovering from trauma that was noticed, recorded, and isn't being integrated. Persistent dissociation is more predictive of acute stress disorder developing into PTSD than disassociation at all. Disassociation in those first 3 days, pretty normal after like an acute stress, an acute trauma. But if you have that going on for months after a disorder, that's when you might be looking at developing PTSD. People who catastrophize the trauma they're going through are more likely to develop PTSD, especially those who present with the symptoms of acute stress disorder and exaggerate the probability of the future being extremely negative. Catastrophizing during and after trauma significantly predicts the development of PTSD. This is people who are like, I'm never going to recover. Nothing will ever be good again. It will always be this way. That is catastrophizing. And if you catch yourself doing it, that's when you use cognitive reappraisal, which we'll get into if we have time. Are we supposed to end at 8 or 8:30? I cannot remember. Oh, good. Like, I definitely have a half an hour of material here. Individuals who experience a freeze response, which is called tonic immobility if you're looking for the technical term, during a traumatic experience are more likely to develop depression and PTSD. This response is both natural and very common, but it can also be linked to feelings of shame or self-blame for their traumatic experience. If you freeze up and then someone else gets hurt, can you see how that could turn into self-blame and recrimination? Sorry, everyone watching this later. We heard disturbing noises outside and we're all like, do we need to go do something? And I don't think so. Okay. Taking personal responsibility for a disaster and catastrophizing one's own role is what is also more likely to make someone develop PTSD. I think this is one reason why so many street medics develop PTSD, is we take on a lot of responsibility for a crisis. We want to help everybody. We want to do everything. Every time we can't help someone, it feels like a personal failure, and then we take that failure home and we castigate ourselves. And then instead of saying, I'll try to do better next time, we just focus on everyone we feel like we've failed. And that's often, I think, how it turns into PTSD. That is my theory as a clergy counselor and not necessarily as a therapist, because I'm not one. Survivors of disaster, crisis, and trauma who exhibit the full syndrome of acute stress disorder according to the DSM-4 or the DSM-5 are a very high risk of developing PTSD. People who have a depressive disorder are more likely to develop PTSD. People who have an anxiety disorder are more likely to develop PTSD. And people who have had significant previous traumas are more likely to develop PTSD. Another reason I think a lot of street medics develop it is that we just keep traumatizing ourselves. We just keep going back out into traumatic environments. When people exhibit acute stress disorder with symptoms so pervasive that they do not allow the survivor to focus on positive experiences in the aftermath of trauma, that may be an indicator as well. Please note again that none of this is intended to diagnose anyone using this guide, cause anyone to diagnose themselves, or encourage any responders to diagnose themselves or to diagnose others. This is intended specifically to help people recognize what their others might be experiencing so that they can seek help for themselves or recommend that others seek help. PTSD. Those at more risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder, people with previous childhood trauma, people with repeated traumas, people who tend towards disassociation already, people who present with the full syndrome of ASD, people who experience significant hyperarousal, including panic attacks during and shortly after a traumatic event, people who experience a freeze response, that tonic immobility during a traumatic event, people who catastrophize, people who tell themselves the future is hopeless, people who exaggerate their own responsibility for disasters that have occurred, people with anxiety disorders, people with depressive disorders, and people with substance use disorders. The symptoms of PTSD fit into 4 categories: reliving the event, recurrent dreams, flashbacks, intrusive memories, unrest in situations that bring back memories of the original trauma. Avoiding situations that remind them of the event, visual associations, smells, sounds, physical surroundings similar to the traumatic event. Negative changes in beliefs and feelings, feelings of numbness, withdrawal from those around them, reduced interest in others and in the outside world, and hyperarousal, constant watchfulness, irritability, jumpiness, being easily startled, outbursts of rage, and insomnia. Children who are experiencing PTSD may repetitively act out their trauma in play, and their symptoms, restlessness, fidgeting, difficulty with paying attention, are often mistaken for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. CPTSD. PTSD usually results from a single incident. Complex PTSD, by contrast, often results from either multiple forms of traumatic events happening to one person and or sustained repeated traumatic events such as chronic sexual abuse, chronic intimate partner violence, human trafficking, war and civil unrest, etc. It is worthwhile to note that CPTSD is not included in the DSM-5. They don't have it in there, which took a broader approach to the diagnosis of PTSD, but it is still included in the International Classification of Diseases, the 11th revision, the ICD-11. As someone who is diagnosed with CPTSD, I have my opinions of the DSM-5 choosing to leave it out, but I'm not going to get into that right now. CPTSD can happen to anyone exposed to repeated or long-term trauma, but it is more likely to occur when someone was hurt by a person that they should be able to trust, like a parent, a caregiver, a guardian, a partner, a spouse, etc. Those at more risk of developing CPTSD are victims of repeat or long-term childhood trauma, victims of bullying and harassment, victims of stalking, victims of long-term physical or sexual abuse, victims of long-term domestic violence or intimate partner violence, victims of human or sex trafficking, victims of war, victims of genocide, and victims of frequent community violence. I want you to think back to the beginning of the class when we were talking about community resilience. And we said that certain communities are more likely to be failed, certain communities are more likely to be hit by disaster really hard. Those communities, do you think if they're really over-policed, they might be victims of frequent community violence? If the police show up just to hurt them and then don't show up in disaster to help them, do you think that that might be an at-risk community for development of PTSD? Okay, I got some yeses. Thank you. Yeah, people who live in a violent community are more likely to develop PTSD. And for some reason, when we talk about violent communities, everybody wants to talk about gang violence. Or we could talk about police violence. We could talk about that. We could talk about being militarized against our own people, and how that might contribute to PTSD. Signs and symptoms of CPTSD. People with CPTSD often have the exact same symptoms as those of PTSD, but they have additional issues. So it's additive rather than like different, there's more. It's emotional regulation issues, identity issues, sense of self issues, and sense of purpose issues, and the ability to build or sustain healthy relationships is often impacted. According to the ICD-11, complex PTSD includes all of the core symptoms of PTSD, such as flashbacks, re-experiencing the traumatic event, avoidance and detachment from people, events, and environmental triggers of the trauma, excessive attention to the possibility of danger, so hypervigilance, and frequent negative thoughts and emotions. In addition, you get the following symptoms: excessive reactivity to negative emotional stimuli with anger and aggressive behavior. This is called affective dysregulation. It's why I'm in anger management therapy. A negative sense of self involving persistent feelings of shame, guilt, failure, and worthlessness, and severe difficulty in forming and maintaining healthy and meaningful relationships. Okay, I'm going to get into anxiety, depression, building personal resilience. I can fit that in a half an hour. Does anyone have any questions on acute stress disorder, PTSD, and CPTSD before we move on?
Someone said that all of this is really great info.
Oh, thank you.
But they had to leave because their brain started to drift.
It's a long and intense class.
But they said that they completely agree with why a lot of street medics have PTSD, like when you were talking about the PlayStation, they were like,
yeah. I want to note that one of the reasons why we record classes is because some people need to take it in chunks. We get into a lot of heavy and difficult information. Sometimes the slides themselves contain images that might be triggering or traumatizing to people, especially if I'm using images of like Hurricane Helene, which some of us were responders to. And also, some people's brains just learn differently and they have to take things in shorter chunks. I am never upset if you need to leave early. Okay, you can always read the notes, flip through the slide deck, watch the recording, listen to my voice while you're doing the dishes. I don't care. Yes.
one person did have to step away for a little bit because it had gotten a little triggering, and they apologized for that.
Nope, no apologies. That is exactly what I want someone to do.
They had said that a little bit a while ago, but I just wanted to share
Yeah.
that.
For the record, if ever I have triggered you or upset you, or you just need a break because this is heavy, just step away. It doesn't upset me, and you don't owe me any apologies. I should have said that at the beginning of class, and that's my failure as an instructor that I didn't say that. All right, anxiety. Being anxious during a disaster or trauma is completely normal. Anxiety is a common feeling that most people experience at some point, which causes increased alertness. Although everyday anxiety is unpleasant, it can also be the body's way of notifying a person of danger. I didn't spend a lot of time on this in the notes, but I'm just going to flag here that having anxiety during a crisis can actually save your life. It can save the life of others. It's how you go, I think we need to leave this building now. I don't know why, but we need to get out, right? Or you go, I don't actually want to wade into that water. Yes.
Fear as well. Fear is an emotion designed to save your life.
Yes. Thank you. There's some problems with it, which I don't have time to get into, but I do recommend reading a book called The Gift of Fear if you have a chance, which talks about how fear is necessary. We need it. It tells us things that we need to pay attention to. And when we ignore it, sometimes really bad things happen. I'm not trying to be victim blaming. I'm not trying to say, oh, you talked yourself out of acknowledging your fear and now you deserve the trauma that happened to you. I'm saying that if you learn to pay attention to your fear, sometimes it can help you save yourself and save others from traumatic things happening. Okay. Persistent anxiety after a disaster or trauma may develop into a disorder, which means that it is more severe, persistent, and interferes with everyday life. People with anxiety often underestimate their own ability to cope with disaster or crisis, which then hinders their recovery. Anxiety symptoms and anxiety disorders can increase a person's risk for depression. Who is at more risk for developing anxiety disorders? People with traumatic histories, people with traumatic childhood experiences, children of contentious divorced parents, people with high stress, people who have experienced catastrophic loss. AFAB people are more likely to develop anxiety disorders than AMAB people are, although I want to note here that that could just be that AMAB people aren't seeking out help for it. They're not recognizing that that's what's happening, and so they go underdiagnosed. I'm always really concerned when we talk about gendered diagnosis and who's more likely to have something, because who do you think is told to shut up about their anxiety? I mean, other than everybody, but specifically, oftentimes, cis men. People who are unhoused, people who are socioeconomically challenged, people experiencing poverty, and people with substance use issues. The signs and symptoms of anxiety are nervousness, fear, worry, racing thoughts, a sense of impending doom, indecisiveness, irritability, impatience, anger, confusion, sleep disruption, bad dreams and nightmares, avoidance, obsession, compulsive behavior, increased substance cravings, increased substance use, increased heart rate, chest pain, shortness of breath, hyperventilation, sweating, dizziness, trembling, shaking, gastrointestinal problems, and muscle aches and pain. Children, especially very young children, may exhibit more somatic or bodily symptoms of anxiety, such as fatigue or complaints of headaches or stomach aches. They may also experience more specific anxiety around separation from loved ones or caregivers that can be caused or exacerbated by their experiences in crisis or disasters. It's extremely common for children to become extremely clingy after a disaster, and trying to immediately be like, no, go self-soothe is how that's going to potentially switch into being depression and isolation and hopelessness instead of anxiety. Okay? I am not a fan of the self-soothe movement, and I don't have time to unpack it right now. But comfort your goddamn kids. Okay. That was blunt. I'm blunt. It's fine. Depression. Disasters can increase the risk of someone developing a depressive disorder. This is especially true if a person has experienced significant losses, both of property and of loved ones, called a bereavement trauma. Some studies have found the incidence of depression in disaster survivors to be as low as 17% and as high as 45% in other studies. PTSD and depression often co-occur, specifically in disaster survivors. So you're going to see a comorbidity where they have both a depressive disorder and PTSD. It should be noted, however, that feeling some symptoms of depression is normal and healthy after a disaster or crisis. Disaster survivors and responders may exhibit depressive symptoms that resolve after a short time without ever developing into a depressive disorder. Those more at risk for developing depression are people with traumatic histories, people with traumatic childhood experiences, children of contentious divorced parents, people with high stress, people who have experienced catastrophic loss, people with serious health challenges, people with chronic illnesses, people who are homebound, people who have previously experienced depression, people whose family members have had episodes of depression, people who are AFAB, 70% more likely to experience depression in their lifetime than someone who is AMAB. Again, I think that this is an underreporting issue. But again, I'm not a mental health professional of that kind, so I don't get to argue with the diagnostic criteria. People in poverty, people who are unhoused, and people who have experienced abuse. The signs and symptoms of depression are loss of interest or pleasure in things they used to enjoy, loss of motivation, fatigue, negativity towards self, others, and the world, negativity about the future, worry, belief that others view them negatively, withdrawal from others, neglect of relationships, loss of sexual desire, hopelessness, helplessness, self-criticism, self-blame, irritability, anger, extremes of emotion, numbness, mood swings, sleep disruption, changes in eating habits, weight loss or weight gain, bad dreams and nightmares, crying, slow speech or movement, quiet speech. I don't know why that says quiet speech. Sorry, it should say quiet. Poor hygiene, headache, irregular menstrual cycle, unexplained aches and pains, non-suicidal self-injury, cravings for substances, use of substances, and also suicidal ideation, which I don't have on here and I need to add. For children, depression can sometimes present in acting out behaviors, including more anger and irritability. Similarly, they may act unmotivated or unfocused, leading them to be pathologized as just being lazy. If a teacher is repeatedly telling you that your kid is lazy, your kid is lazy, your kid is lazy, your kid is lazy, that might be a time to seek out a mental health professional, because it could be that they are actually suffering from something like depression, which presents as looking lazy to uneducated adults. Individual resilience. Personal resilience in adults can be understood in 4 dimensions, according to Robert J. Taormina's theory. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that person's name. I just realized I've only ever read it and never heard it spoken aloud. They are determination, endurance, adaptability, and recuperability. Determination is defined as that sense of purpose we were talking about earlier, that mastery of oneself, the willpower to persevere. It is a conscious choice. People are like, well, I don't have that. You can train it. You can do that with a mental health professional in dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, other forms of therapy, or you can just be like, I'm going to build that. I'm going to decide that I'm going to have that, and I'm going to find what it is for me. In Sanctum of the Crafts religious stuff, which I'm not trying to convince you to attend, I'm just saying we call this finding your guiding star, the thing that keeps you going on the path when everything else fails. Endurance is the strength and fortitude a person can possess to face difficult situations without giving up. This can be physical, mental, and/or emotional. And really, if you're going to be a responder, you want to be honing all 3. You want to be building all 3. Now, you're going to build them to different degrees based on what's going on with you. Like, I'm never not going to be disabled. My physical endurance will always be influenced by that. Just like my mental endurance will always be impacted by the fact that I have diagnosed OCD. I have diagnosed CPTSD. I have to take that into account. But I can be as enduring as I can be. Does that make sense? All right. Adaptability is the ability to be flexible and resourceful, adjusting to changing circumstances during adversity, crisis, and disaster. It may involve conscious efforts to change one's thinkings and be flexible in response to tribulations. Recuperability is the ability to rebuild physically, mentally, and emotionally from adversity and regain a sense of safety, stability, and personal value. The ability to physically recuperate is often what people think of when they think of personal resilience, but it is far more than just physical recovery that matters. However, that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. Taking care of the body with adequate fuel and hydration is vital for mental and emotional recuperation as well. Recuperability is the characteristic of resilience that allows people to recover, with recovery as the goal of recuperation. People who are resilient, continuing to adapt and function in the aftermath of a trauma, should not be presumed to be out of risk for developing PTSD. Resilient people may actually not recognize when they need help, may not know how to ask for it, or may be assumed by those around them to be so competent as to not need it, even when they do ask. This has happened to me. I'm not trying to toot my own horn here, but I'm a fairly competent person, and people tend to depend on me in disaster, which I've set myself up for. So when I do need help, I sometimes express it to people and have them be like, you? You need help? And it's like, yeah, I do. I'm not okay. I need help. And sometimes they're not actually willing to do that without commenting repeatedly about how they would never have expected me to need that help. Do you think that's helpful? Do you think that makes me feel like I should reach out again? Am I ever going to reach out to that specific person again? When you assume that someone is so resilient that they would never need help, you're actually undercutting one of the abilities that makes them resilient, which is knowing when to ask for help. Remember that monitoring step in stress first aid for building personal resilience, where you're paying attention to your own stress signs and knowing when to ask for help? Part of building resiliency is being like, wow, okay, I'm not okay. I'm not okay and I do need help. That is part of personal resiliency. And so when you shut down someone and you say, well, you're really competent, you don't actually really need help, now you're damaging their resiliency. Make sense? Okay. Some things have been found to weaken individual resiliency. Unfortunately, the very thing that helps people identify that they may be struggling with their mental health and need help, more information available to people about mental health disorders, can actually weaken resilience. All negative mental and emotional symptoms are now being pathologized by both professional mental health community as well as often by people with no mental health training, degrees, certifications, or licensing. The online world is full of people claiming that any presentation of negative mental and emotional symptoms has to be treated by therapy and is always a serious disorder. This can cause a person to weaken their own resilience by assuming that any presentation of negative mental or emotional state is then developing into PTSD. This may not actually directly cause PTSD, though there's some interesting studies going on about like if you assume you have PTSD, does that give you PTSD? But it can worsen the symptoms of their stress by denying them some of the skills that they can use to handle that stress. How many of you are on TikTok? Okay, did you ever get into the end of the mental health community where they're just like casually diagnosing everyone around them with, yeah, okay. That's really common online, and that is actually damaging to people's resiliency. The assumption that any sign of stress is acute stress disorder. The assumption that any sign of trauma is PTSD. Yes, Lex.
This is going to cause PTSD, this is going to cause PTSD, and they keep doing it over and over and over again, and they make the person going through the moment relive everything that's going on beforehand or during that moment.
Yep.
It's the exact same thing.
Yep. If you pathologize someone just because they are experiencing the normal, healthy spectrum of human emotion, that can actually cause some disordered thinking. We are supposed to feel, okay? We're supposed to. We're designed to. Anger, fear, sadness, all of that is normal. It is normal part of the human expression of emotions. And so when we treat it as abnormal, that can cause problems. Unfortunately, one of the steps recommended in stress first aid, psychological first aid, and mental health first aid can also weaken resilience. That step is to refer to medical and psychiatric experts to intervene, recommending therapeutic intervention for normal adaptive reactions. The assumption that these normal stress reactions are a symptom of a disorder can actually damage a person's resiliency. So you need to really work on knowing when to recommend therapy to someone and when to be like, I'm going to wait, see how they're doing, give them some time, let them have the space to react and feel what they're feeling. And if in a few weeks it seems as though they are deteriorating, that's when I'm going to follow up. However, I will note that responders to disaster often aren't going to meet people a few weeks later. And so you can just have a sheet of like, hey, here's some resources for you if you need them, rather than being like, I think you're going to need therapy. Okay, I think that you're going to develop PTSD and you're going to need therapy. You can just be like, hey, here's a sheet of resources in case you need them later. Do you see the difference in those two approaches? Okay. Responders are also sometimes encouraged in trainings on crisis and mental health to dismiss or denigrate the wisdom and capability of the communities they serve and the people in them. Communities and individuals have sometimes developed their own style of resiliency, and having someone come in and dismiss that can make them not rely on their own methods, taking away the tools they use to get through disasters. I saw this a lot when working with First Nations communities. Which has happened a few times in disaster response, and also in like human crisis response, like with No Dapple. We don't get to come into communities, whether that's like a socioeconomically challenged Latin community or a Black community in Katrina or a First Nations community after a flood in the Appalachian Mountains, and be like, nah, your traditional ways of handling trauma, throw those all out, do ours instead. Remember that thing about spirituality providing resilience? You don't get to just be like, excuse me, your traditional methods of healing cannot be applied here. You absolutely have to go to a Western mental health provider and trust in them over your traditional means. No, trust in the wisdom of the communities you serve. You do not know better than them when you enter into them. Catastrophizing also reduces resiliency. When responders dramatically catastrophize, referring to disaster and crisis using terms that build them up to be even worse than they already were, that may make it harder for people to feel resilient in the face of them. They can also weaken their own resilience because they begin to see the disasters and crises as being too big to face or too hard to get through. You also don't want to minimize what someone's going through and be like, it's not that bad that your house burned down. Don't do that either. But don't be like, God has punished us with this horrific fire. There's a middle ground. There's some nuance to be found here. Building individual resilience first involves recognizing how frequently people are resilient in the face of adversity. Even people who develop PTSD or CPTSD can recover. Resiliency ends not when symptoms of stress start, but when people give up against them. It is important to note, however, that seeking mental health support is not the same as giving up and can be a healthy part of coping if it is not pathologized. Going to get CBT or DBT or whatever, that's not giving up. That is like the opposite of giving up. That's getting help. Things people can do to build their personal resilience. Recognize their own autonomy. Who's responsible for you? Well, I'm your parent. Okay, of course I'm responsible for you. I'm being trolled from off camera. Who is responsible for you? Come on. Thank you. You are responsible for you. You have to master yourself. The only person you control is you. The only person that you have mastery over is you. You don't have the right to master or control anyone else, but you do have the responsibility to master and control yourself. Acknowledge that adversity can be overcome. Realize that they may have to make difficult choices to be active participants in their recovery, but that they are capable of making those difficult choices. Be flexible in their coping methods. Everyone copes differently, and there isn't a correct model of self-care during a crisis, only certain things to avoid, like using substances to distract from the situation. Shift priorities, recalibrate their expectations, recreate their own sense of safety, distract themselves. Research has shown that in emotionally intense contexts, distraction can be more effective at reducing distress. However, only cognitive reappraisal allows for proper emotional processing, which is important for long-term resiliency. Distraction can become an unhealthy coping mechanism. There's like good distraction and bad distraction. Use cognitive reappraisal. Fully experience a trauma's cognitive and emotional impact and significance. Accept the significance of the trauma, crisis, or disaster, but don't exaggerate it. Maintain goals, focus on hope, master oneself, and continue with life. A breakthrough in developing a model of adult personal resilience scale was made in a study with 10 items for each of the 4 dimensions of personal resiliency. All the items were based on a comprehensive review and analysis of the studies on building resilience that occurred before 2014. Wei and Taormina found 40 items that fit on the 4 dimensions, but this was reduced for creating the model to 20 items to avoid confusion and difficulty. The 20 items for the 4 5-item subscales of adult personal resilience look like this. Determination. Once I set a goal, I am determined to achieve it. I persevere at the things I decide despite difficulties. Being determined is an important part of my character. I keep trying for the things I want until I reach them. It is in my nature to be persevering. Endurance. I am able to live through difficult times. I can withstand difficult situations. I can endure the problems that life brings. I can survive even the hardest of times. I can endure even when I am intact. Adaptability. I have the ability to adapt to difficult situations. I can change to fit many different kinds of circumstances. I can find ways to adapt to unexpected conditions. I am well able to adjust to the problems that confront me. I am very flexible when my environment changes. Recuperability. I recuperate even from things that hit me hard. I recover from any misfortune that happens to me. I am able to bounce back from any kind of adversity. I always resume my life regardless of the type of setback. I can recover from any type of problem. This is a form of cognitive reappraisal. Cognitive reappraisal is a mental health strategy that involves changing one's perspective on and interpretation of a traumatic event in order to reduce its impact. It is a form of emotional regulation that relies on confronting the trauma rather than suppressing it or avoiding it. I do not recommend the positivity doctrine. That is not the same thing as cognitive reappraisal. The positivity doctrine is, if I just manifested good things will happen to me. And so I have to not feel the negativity of what is happening because I have to only feel good and positive things, or the bad thing will happen again. Okay, that's the positivity doctrine. Cognitive reappraisal is not that. The process involves identifying the trauma, recognizing what triggered the difficult emotions, challenging those negative thoughts, finding alternative perspectives, and reinterpreting what occurred as something that can be adapted to and overcome. One of them is, don't look at it, don't acknowledge it, don't feel it. The other is actually, okay, I'm going to turn and look at this. I'm going to understand why I'm feeling this way. I'm going to allow myself to have some time to feel it. And then I'm going to say, all right, what next? I can move past this. So am I going to? Time to get up now. Time to keep moving. Not only has research found it to be effective at helping build resiliency against trauma, but neuroimaging has also found that cognitive reappraisal activates areas of the brain associated with cognitive control and emotional regulation. The important part of it is that you don't just like shove it down before going like, no, I can keep going. I can keep going. I can keep going. You actually are like, yeah, that's shitty. That sucked. That was awful. That was horrific. Nobody should ever have to go through that. That wasn't fair. That wasn't right. That wasn't okay. But I am capable of getting past it. I am capable of rebuilding my life. I am going to keep moving. What next? Let's keep going. What's going to give me a sense of purpose in this moment? What's going to help me reframe this so that I'm still going towards my guiding star? Treating PTSD. This guide is not intended for mental health providers beyond clergy counselors, such as therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists. Thus, this section is not intended to teach anyone how to treat PTSD, because I can't legally or ethically do that. However, we do want to talk about the role of cognitive behavioral therapy. Some studies have found that cognitive behavioral therapy may improve the immediate psychological symptoms of acute stress disorder directly after a trauma. However, there hasn't been a lot of research that established whether that recovery is better or more significant than the recovery that occurs naturally in most people. However, several randomized controlled trials have found that cognitive behavioral therapy can be effective at treating later PTSD symptoms. Others have established that earlier intervention, right at the beginning of PTSD symptoms appearing, is effective at reducing the risk of long-term PTSD. The cognitive behavioral training specifically for trauma and PTSD tends to focus on education, therapeutically guided reliving and exposure to the traumatic memories, cognitive restructuring, confrontation and refutation of maladaptive beliefs, training in self-care, coping, and problem-solving strategies. Multiple studies have found that supportive counseling is not effective at treating PTSD on its own, and some indicate that it may actually hinder natural recovery from acute stress disorder. Supportive counseling is where you just sit and talk, and the person's like, that sounds so hard. Yeah, that was really difficult. I understand what you're saying to me. That's supportive counseling. It's where someone just sits there and listens to you go on and on and on. It's not effective for treating PTSD. It's not effective for treating acute stress disorder and preventing it from turning into PTSD. People who received cognitive behavioral therapy maintained their improvement and recovery significantly more than people who were in supportive counseling alone. People with acute stress disorder and PTSD also tend to drop out of supportive counseling, but stay more committed to cognitive behavioral therapy. However, some people will still drop out of cognitive behavioral therapy or fail to respond to it. It isn't a perfect one-size-fits-all cure for PTSD, but rather a good option for a person to consider if they feel they are in need of mental health support from a professional for dealing with their PTSD. There are a number of other clinical approaches to PTSD that are being researched, including eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is called EMDR, which a number of studies have shown to potentially be as effective as cognitive behavioral therapy. EMDR, at least the reprocessing step, is contraindicated for people who are on the autism spectrum, who have seizures, who are in active psychosis, who are actively suicidal, or who have active substance use issues. It is not for everyone. It's one of those things where I keep seeing it like all the street medics are constantly being recommended to have EMDR is not for everybody. Everything has contraindications. Drinking too much water has contraindications and adverse effects, okay? Do not assume that there's ever like a one size fits all perfect solution to any of this, because there isn't. But there is hope. There is a sense of purpose to be found, and you need to focus on those things, and you need to believe that you can master yourself. Okay? All right. That is the notes. And I thought if I had time, and I do have 5 minutes left, that I would just rapidly tell you all best practices for a panic attack. Because we just went through acute stress disorder, right? And we touched on the fact that panic attacks happen during that. How many of you have been in a disaster and seen someone have a panic attack? All right. How many of you have been in a disaster and you had a panic attack? Okay. So let's talk about some things not to do if someone has a panic attack. We're just going to throw this in really quick because I really wanted to fit it into acute stress disorder, and then it was like, I don't know if I'll have time. Do not have someone breathe into a brown paper bag or any kind of paper bag. What do you exhale when you breathe out? CO2. Excellent. Do you think breathing that back in helps with a panic attack? Exactly. Well done. Don't do that. It's actually kind of harmful. It's severely harmful, and it can increase the chances of somebody passing out from a panic attack, which can happen. It's a myth that it can't. I've heard the whole like, oh, you can't actually pass out from a panic attack. Yes, you can. And the danger then is in hitting your head. Okay. Do not give someone something to eat or drink during a panic attack. Used to be that we would tell street medics that if you got someone to drink water or eat a piece of chocolate or suck on a hard candy, that would help with a panic attack. It turns out that A, they can asphyxiate because they're breathing really rapidly, and 2, that nausea and vomiting are symptoms of panic attacks. And so if you give someone something to eat or drink, they might throw up, which then increases their panic. Next, do not touch someone who is going through a panic attack. This is another thing that was taught to street medics back when I was first learning. They'd say put a gentle, supportive hand on someone. It turns out that your sensory system goes haywire during a panic attack, and being touched at all can make it worse. People can become hypersensitive to being touched, or the opposite. They might start going numb, and they're looking at you touching them, and they're like, why can't I feel that? Why can't I feel that? And that freaks them out more. Keep your hands to yourself in general as a street medic, unless you're actively treating someone. Keep your hands to yourself. Okay, additionally, don't ask someone to chew on peppercorns. I don't know where this myth came from that having someone chew on peppercorns will prevent a panic attack. Don't put anything in somebody's mouth, but certainly don't have them chew on peppercorns. It is not effective. The other thing is there used to be a recovery position that people taught for panic attacks where you put your head between your knees. That actually, again, compresses breathing. The posture makes it so that you have a harder time getting enough air, which you're already struggling with a panic attack, so don't do that either. You want to actually just be like, hey, can you name the 5 things that you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can smell, 2 things you can taste? You're familiar with this structure? Sorry. Is it supposed to be feel, see? I should have had smell, taste, yeah, touch. Okay, look that up because I'm not remembering it correctly, and I'm just going to call myself out right now that I probably have those in the wrong order. Additionally, you can just walk someone through some deep breathing exercises and just be like, hey, I think that you might be having a panic attack. I understand that it's overwhelming. Would you like to just breathe with me for a minute? Let's try and do some deep breathing. Let's try and breathe like a baby breathes, all the way down, deep into the belly. Right? That's what you can do. Okay. You can learn more about that again in mental health first aid if they get into treatment of a panic attack. But a lot of the things that street medics were originally taught, you should not do. And then I said if we had time at the end, I would go on a rant. We are at time, so by all means, if you don't want to stick around for the rant, don't. But I'm just going to say that recently, myself and my partner, my buddy for street medic stuff, who also is the person who generally runs our slides, were invited to attend a disaster mental health training event. That's what it was billed at. It was billed as training. And during this training, at the very beginning, the person was like, I actually need everybody's legal names because I have to abide by HIPAA for this because this is therapy. And we were like, wait a second, we didn't consent to therapy. What's going on? Also, I'm not really comfortable giving my legal name as a street medic without knowing what your security is like. Then, additionally, this person actually took people through therapeutic things: EMDR, somatic breathing, and mindfulness meditations. All three in the course of this training without saying they were doing that. They were like, I'm going to put a picture up and I want your eyes to move around and I want you to do this breathing while you're doing it. I'm like, this is EMDR. Why did this person not like say, I'm going to do EMDR and get everyone's informed consent for that? Then after doing the exercise, they were like, I just did EMDR with all of you. This is extremely unethical for a mental health provider to the point where I considered reporting them. And I haven't actually decided what I'm doing with that yet. That's the rant. Don't do that shit to people. One, you're not mental health professionals, so you shouldn't be doing therapy at all. But also, as we covered in this class, some of those things are contraindicated for some people. There is no one size fits all, and you do not provide that kind of thing without informed consent where someone knows who it is contraindicated for. Okay, that was the rant. Now, questions. I know we covered a lot of information. It is okay if no one has questions. If you think of questions later, you can email us at staff@sanctumofthecraft.org and we will endeavor to answer. We do have a mental health person who volunteers for us who can also help us give accurate answers, but obviously could not provide therapy without you being in therapy with that person. Okay. No questions. Snark. Sarcasm. Alrighty.
Thanks for all the info.
Thank you. And did they get the link to the notes if they want them later?
Yes,
excellent. Okay. Phew. The recording of this class will get posted to YouTube and also to our Patreon in the free public crisis preparedness section, or I think it's called a collection on Patreon. Additionally, the link to the video will be provided to Ruma to distribute. They can give it to whoever wants it. And I believe our next one this week is digital only. Next one this month, next week, is digital only, and it is on respiratory ailments and conditions, preventing them, treating them as street medics in the context of collective resilience medicine. Okay. Yep, that's virtual. That is going to be on Zoom. We'll be posting a link to Instagram, Facebook, the calendar. And you can tune in there. It's at the same time, but I believe it's on Thursday, not Wednesday.
Yep. I have a question.
Yes.
Do we know when the psychological first aid follow-up to this will happen?
Not yet, probably in November. Yeah, you're good to start.